Hey guys, tonight we're settling in for something genuinely unsettling, a slow descent into the reality of surviving London in 1888, one of history's most textured nightmares. I want you to imagine this with me. You've just arrived in Whitechapel as the sun dips below the roofline, painting the sky that bruised Victorian orange-grey that you'll come to know intimately. The fog is already rising, not the polite morning mist you might picture, but something thicker, something that tastes like coal dust and horse manure when you breathe it in. The sound is immediate and overwhelming, the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the rattle of carts, the voice noise of thousands of people pressed into streets so narrow that sunlight has to apply for permits. Vendors are shouting prices for things you can't quite identify. Somewhere, a woman is laughing. Somewhere else, someone is coughing with the kind of persistence that suggests their lungs filed for divorce from their body months ago. You've got 4p in your pocket. That's basically pocket lint to a modern wallet. But to you right now, it's a decision-making resource. You need shelter tonight. Not comfort. Not safety in any modern sense. Just a roof between your body and the infinite British drizzle that's already started its evening assault. You probably won't survive this intact. Your lungs will be angry. Your joints will remember this cold for years. The bed you're about to lie in was warm just an hour ago because another man was lying in it, and he's only just vacated it so you could pay the same penny and take his body heat inheritance. Here's the thing. This isn't a history book you can close when it gets overwhelming. This is immersion. This is the actual experience that millions of actual people, your great-great-great-grandparents' neighbours, lived through as a completely ordinary Tuesday. They didn't have the luxury of thinking about how difficult it was. They just had to keep breathing, keep working, keep existing, until they either accumulated enough money for something better or their body decided to shut down operations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not here to preach to you. I'm here to tell stories that matter, and that only works if you're actually interested. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. I love knowing where people are settling in for these journeys. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push through the crowd on Whitechapel Road, and your eyes are already watering from the fog and smoke mixing in a way that no modern air ever quite does. The smell hits in layers. Horse urine, strong. Cooking oil, rancid. Human bodies pressed too close, complex. And underneath it all, the constant sulphurous undertone of a city that's burning coal to keep itself alive. You're looking for a doss house, a lodging place for transient men, the kind of establishment that asks no questions about where you're from or what you did yesterday, and charges accordingly. You find one on a side street where the press of humanity is slightly less suffocating. A narrow building with a ground floor entrance that smells like every previous tenant's regrets. The keeper is a woman with the face of someone who has seen every possible variation of human desperation and found most of them unremarkable. She's smoking a clay pipe and barely glances at you. 4p, she says. You pay. She hands you a ticket and points you toward a narrow staircase. No questions, no paperwork. This is commerce in its most elemental form, money for the briefest possible claim on horizontal space. The room you're shown to is barely 8 feet by 6, with a single window that opens onto a back alley, where something is both fermenting and burning simultaneously. The bed is a narrow iron frame with what might be a mattress. It's definitely lumpy, covered with sheets that were white possibly during the Napoleonic Wars. A single candle in a holder sits on a shelf. A bucket in the corner serves purposes that don't require elaboration. Your fellow lodgers are already arranged around you. A man with a persistent cough in the corner, someone snoring with the dedication of a professional, and a third person whose main feature is a general atmosphere of quiet resignation. The sounds of Whitechapel continue outside your window. Footsteps, voices, the distant clang of something being fixed or broken. Horses move along the street. Someone is having a spirited disagreement with someone else, their voices carrying that particular London working-class edge that suggests violence might be imminent, but also might just be enthusiasm. You lie down on the mattress and feel it exhale a breath that contains at least 3 previous decades of occupancy. The pillow smells like hair oil and the vague sorrow of strangers. Sleep comes, eventually with difficulty, and is interrupted periodically by your roommate's various respiratory adventures. By dawn, you haven't really rested so much as briefly stopped being fully awake. Your body aches in ways that feel new and permanent. Your throat is raw from the fog and smoke combination you've been breathing. Your eyes feel like they've been packed in fine sandpaper. You can hear the city waking up around you, and you know that the real survival begins now. Finding work, finding food, finding some way to earn enough to pay for tomorrow night's borrowed warmth and tomorrow's borrowed sheet. Welcome to London, 1888. You've arrived. The air you're breathing right now is actively trying to kill you, and not in a metaphorical way. This is one of the central facts of survival in 1888 London, and it shapes everything. Your morning cough, your afternoon headaches, the way your clothes always feel damp with something that isn't quite rain. London burns coal, approximately 12 million tonnes of coal per year, which is roughly equivalent to burning the weight of every person in the city, alive and dead, about 67 times over. All of that coal smoke has to go somewhere, and somewhere is primarily your lungs. The fog you've seen in paintings and heard about in stories, the pea super, isn't actually fog at all. It's smoke fog, coal smoke mixing with water vapour to create something closer to a solid than a gas. When the wind drops and the air pressure drops, it settles over the city like a thermal blanket made of sulphur and regret. These fogs don't arrive and leave quietly. A really thick one can last for days, turning midday into something that resembles twilight. In December 1952, well, I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but this is worth knowing. London will experience one of these fogs so dense and lethal that 4,000 people will die directly from it, and the government will eventually pass laws to try to prevent it. But in 1888, this is just Tuesday weather. This is normal. The fact that it's toxic is something you've simply incorporated into the basic math of existence. The sulphur in the air combines with water to create sulphurous acid, actual acid you're breathing. Your respiratory system is slowly being corroded by the air itself. By the time you're 30 years old, if you're a London worker, your lungs have the texture of something that's been gently sandpapered from the inside. The coughing you hear constantly, the coughing that seems to be everyone's permanent soundtrack, that's the sound of bodies trying to expel something that cannot be expelled because you have to breathe. But here's where it gets really grim. The fog gets everywhere. Courts of law have actually adjourned because the air inside the courtroom was so thick with smog that the judge literally couldn't see the defendants. Some of the theatres, on bad fog days, simply couldn't operate because the stage was obscured from the audience by the accumulated smoke fog hanging in the air. Historians still argue whether the great smog events, there were several severe ones in this era, killed more people than the actual plagues. Though the 1952 fog proved that these weren't just dramatic tales, they were genuine extinction events happening in slow motion. You step out of your DOS house the next morning and immediately feel the impact. The air has a texture. It's not just visible, though it is, it's tactile. It coats your throat. It stings your eyes. If you're unlucky enough to have an open cut on your hands, which given the nature of dock work you probably do, it feels like you're exposing it to a mild chemical burn every time you breathe. Respiratory diseases are the constant background companion of survival. Not the dramatic tuberculosis, though that's here too, but the slow erosion, bronchitis, pneumonia's milder cousin, the kind of persistent chest congestion that just becomes a permanent feature of existing in this city. People cough, constantly, in shops, on the street, in pubs. Every fourth person you pass is engaged in some level of productive lung evacuation. The working poor tend to accept this the way they accept everything else, as an unchangeable feature of the landscape, like gravity or the social hierarchy. You might die of this. Statistically, it's actually pretty likely, but you might also live to old age and just spend those old years wheezing, unable to climb stairs, unable to do anything that requires sustained exertion. The middle and upper classes, who live away from the industrial centres and who have better air circulation in their homes, develop respiratory diseases at significantly lower rates, which adds another layer to the grinding unfairness of the era. The smell of London is the smell of coal. It gets into your clothes, it gets into your hair, it gets into your food. People cook in it, wash their faces in water that's been sitting open in it. Mothers wipe children's faces with cloths that have been absorbing this air for months. The soot that accumulates on every surface in the city is essentially powdered coal that fell out of the air and decided to live on your windowsill. You can literally wipe it off with your hand and your hand comes away black. There's a curious optimism in London during this period, a sense that progress and industrialisation are good, that the coal smoke is the price of progress and prosperity. Nobody quite wants to acknowledge that the price is being paid in years of life, in compromised lungs, in children born with persistent respiratory problems. The fog is treated as a sort of quirky British weather phenomenon rather than what it actually is, an atmospheric disaster that nobody's figured out how to solve yet. You walk through the fog-drenched streets, and you can barely see 10 feet ahead of you. The gas lamps, and yes, it's gas, not electricity, though some buildings are getting electric lights, are just vague glows in the murk. People navigate by memory, by the sound of other people, by the occasional horse's whinny. It's deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities, but to the people living here, it's just London in winter. This is what you breathe, this is what you live in. This is simply the cost of being alive in the greatest city in the world. You need to think about where you're going to sleep tonight, because where you slept last night is not available to you again unless you're willing to pay another fourpence. The doss housekeeper, who looked at you with such professional indifference, has already rented your mattress to someone else, and you're now a problem to be moved along. This is the arithmetic of poverty in 1888. Every single night is a separate negotiation, a separate small crisis that needs a small amount of money to solve. The spectrum of available accommodation in London ranges from bad to apocalyptic. At the bottom of the scale, you have the twopenny hangover, which is exactly as dignified as it sounds. For 2p, you get to lean against a rope stretched across a room, maybe slightly above waist height. You hang there, leaning on the rope, in the same position as dozens of other men, all through the night. When the morning comes and the rope is removed, you fall into a heap with everyone else and shuffle out, your spine having developed several new opinions about gravity and justice. Slightly higher on the ladder of acceptable desperation is the fourpenny bed arrangement you experienced last night. A genuine bed, albeit one that's been absorbing the sweat and possibly other substances of previous occupants for years. The blankets have a colour that might best be described as history, and a texture that suggests they've been used for purposes beyond the originally intended bedding. But it's a bed. You can lie down, you can pretend to sleep. The truly grim achievement, and historians still argue whether this was actually practiced as widely as reported, or whether people simply reported it more because it was shockingly awful, is the hot bed system. Multiple lodgers share a single bed in shifts. You get the bed while it's warm from the previous user's body heat, because heating water for any kind of cleanliness is impossible at this price point. Imagine lying down in bedding that's still warm, still humid, still carrying the full thermal memory of someone else's night. You sleep, you get up. The next person, often without any interval at all, lies down in what is essentially your shaped warm space. The bed never cools down because someone is always using it. The room you might find yourself in is maybe 12 feet by 8, and there are 8 or 9 of you in it. Everyone is sleeping because the lodging keeper charges by the horizontal surface area you occupy, not by the number of hours you spend in the building. So you might come in at 7 in the evening, sleep, and then have to be out by 7 in the morning, even if you've only actually slept for 3 of those hours, because that's when the next shift of sleepers arrives. Cleanliness is not part of this equation. The lodging keepers would need to actually empty and wash bedding between uses, and that costs money and time. Instead, sheets are changed maybe weekly, or when they reach a point of visible decay that suggests they're about to fail structurally. Bed bugs are inevitable. The saying, sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite, isn't cute Victorian whimsy. It's an actual practical warning because the bugs are absolutely real and absolutely there, waiting for you to stop moving so they can extract a small blood dividend from your body. You will wake up itching. Everyone does. The economics of shelter in 1888 are organised around the absolute minimum viability. A working man, someone with a job that gives him irregular daily income from dock work or casual labour, can typically earn between 3 and 6 shillings per week. A shilling is 12p. 4p for a bed is therefore substantial, but if you're working and you have somewhere to sleep, that's the price of basic survival. If you're unemployed or between jobs, 4p is the entire difference between having shelter and being outside in the fog and cold. There's no look for a better paying job safety net. There's no borrow money from your family option. There's just the immediate calculation. Do I have 4p? If yes, I sleep indoors. If no, I sleep in the doorway, or the railway arch, or wherever else won't result in immediate arrest. The doss house is actually an improvement over historical options. Before the mid-century, the truly desperate would have been sleeping in actual filth, sewage ditches, abandoned buildings, places that are outside even Victorian society's acceptance. The doss houses at least provide walls and a roof, and the fiction of commercial transaction, which means you're a customer, not a vagrant. The distinction matters legally and socially, even if the actual sleeping conditions are barely distinguishable. The buildings themselves are often subdivided beyond reason. A house designed for one family might now contain 30 or 40 people, renting individual corners or beds or sections of space. The walls are thin enough that you're essentially sleeping in a room full of other people's breathing sounds and bodily noises, all separated by wood partitions that might as well be curtains. The shared access to any kind of sanitation facility means that the corridors smell like the collective failures of human dignity. You walk from lodging place to lodging place, checking availability, checking price, checking whether you have the required coins. Some keepers might offer you a week's discount if you commit to a week's lodging. That might bring it down to 3.5 pence per night. Others charge more if business is good. It's market economics at its most brutal. If it rains, the price might go up because more people need shelter. If the weather's clear, you might negotiate slightly downward. The photograph on the mantelpiece, if there is a mantelpiece, which there probably isn't in a doss house, but there might be in a slightly more respectable lodging house, would show families. The doss houses are primarily for single men, the truly transient poor. But there are also lodging houses that rent rooms by the week, where families cluster into spaces barely larger than your doss house bed. A family of 6 might share a single room, where children sleep on the floor or packed multiple per bed, where cooking happens on a small charcoal stove if they're lucky, and where privacy is a concept that applies to nobody. You find a doss house with availability and pay your 4pence. The keeper barely looks at you. This is business. You're not interesting. You're just a small financial transaction happening between now and tomorrow morning. Your stomach is announcing its absolute emptiness in a way that suggests it's filing a formal complaint with your central nervous system, and you've got maybe a shilling in your pocket, which needs to cover not just breakfast but potentially dinner and any other unexpected survival costs. The food available to you in London in 1888 is a minefield of intentional adulteration, accidental contamination, and substances that would probably require hazmat suits if you examined them under modern scrutiny. The street food vendors are out in force, their carts positioned at corners where working people pass, the docks, factory entrances, railway stations. They're calling out their wares with that particular kind of aggressive cheer that suggests they're trying to convince you to eat something before you can fully think about what it actually is. Coffee and hot chocolate are favourites. A penny, hot coffee, get your hot coffee echoing through the morning streets. The coffee is made in enormous urns that are rarely cleaned. The water comes from municipal sources that are, let's say, inconsistent in their purity. The coffee itself is often an indeterminate brown liquid that contains coffee, probably, possibly, maybe. There are stories of coffee vendors adding burnt bread dust, chicory root, sawdust, and substances that were never officially categorized. Bread is the dietary foundation. A loaf of bread, a pound or so, costs about 2 pence and can sustain you for the better part of a day. Bread is also where the real alchemical food crime happens. Bakers, facing rising flour prices and competition, have become creative about stretching their ingredients. Alum, a chemical compound used in leather tanning, makes bread whiter and fluffier. Customers prefer white bread, so bakers add alum. What does alum do to your digestive system? Well, it's basically a corrosive compound that your stomach is not equipped to process. Long-term alum consumption doesn't kill you quickly, but it definitely damages you. Chalk is added for the same reason. White bread equals good bread equals higher price. Chalk doesn't taste like anything, and your stomach can't really process it, so it just passes through you. But the customer satisfaction is higher. Milk is adulterated with water. Fine, water is cheap and milk is expensive, the math makes sense. But the water itself might be contaminated, and sometimes, to make watered milk look richer, sellers add chalk. So you've got a beverage that is contaminated water with chalk that's supposed to look like milk. This is considered normal commerce. This is not seen as especially unethical, because everyone's doing it, and everyone's aware that everything is probably contaminated. Sweets and candies are sometimes laced with arsenic, though not intentionally. Certain dyes used to colour sweets contain arsenic as a byproduct of the dye production process. a child might eat a penny's worth of sweets and be consuming enough arsenic for an adult to experience poisoning symptoms. This is not prosecuted aggressively because causation is hard to prove, and arsenic poisoning looks a lot like just ordinary illness, which is extremely common. The Bradford poisoning incident of 1858 is worth remembering, though it's 30 years in the past. Someone distributed a particularly potent arsenic-laced candy at a festival, and 200 people fell ill. It became a massive scandal because it was massive and dramatic and impossible to ignore. But the everyday slow poisoning of the population through adulterated food, that's just business. That's just the cost of eating food made by people trying to make a profit in a system with minimal regulation and no meaningful inspection. You need to eat, so you buy a loaf of bread and some dripping, which is rendered pork fat, a byproduct of butchering that's cheap and calorie-dense. You eat standing up or sitting on a curb if you're feeling luxurious. The bread tastes like it's lightly sweetened alum, and the dripping is probably rancid because fat goes rancid, and the seller isn't particularly concerned with freshness, just with not having it actively smell like a graveyard. It fills the immediate hole in your stomach. You don't think about what's in it beyond the basic categories of carbohydrate and fat. Thinking is a luxury. Coffee at a vendor's cart is a penny, and comes in a tin cup that the vendor might rinse in cold water between customers. The water in the urn is perpetually reheated, never fully cleaned, just topped off with more water and more grounds. So by the end of the day, the coffee is a concentrated essence of every drink served that morning, heated multiple times, accumulated solids settling at the bottom. You drink it because it's hot and it's marginally less contaminated than water from a public pump. Better establishments, if you have 2 pence instead of 1, offer breakfast in a coffee house, which is not a cosy place, but rather a working establishment where you can sit while eating. You get bread and butter, maybe with a boiled egg, and a cup of actual coffee that's been made more recently. Eggs are a luxury protein. They cost a halfpenny each usually. A proper breakfast of bread, butter and an egg plus a cup of coffee might run you 3 or 4 pence, which is approaching a full night's lodging in terms of expense. Herrings are common, smoked herring, split and fried, filling and relatively cheap. The fish smell is overwhelming. Your clothes will carry it. The fish itself is incredibly salty, which is both a preservation technique and also a way to mask the taste of fish that's been smoked so thoroughly that the original flavour is almost incidental. You eat it because it's cheap and it's protein and it fills your stomach. You drink water after and hope the water isn't actively dangerous. Meat pies are sold in the streets, meat being a generous term here. Historians still argue whether the term mystery meat pie comes from this era or is a much more modern creation, but the joke is apt. The meat inside could be pork, beef, mutton, horse, or potentially dog, and you wouldn't necessarily know because the pie filling is heavily seasoned with pepper and salt, designed to mask the taste of whatever is inside. You make a mental calculation. If I spend 3 pence on breakfast, I have 10 pence left for the day. That's enough for one more meal, a bread and dripping lunch, maybe a bowl of thin soup for dinner. That leaves 2 pence for emergencies, transportation or lodging if you can find a cheaper option. Or you skip lunch and have dripping again and save money. Or you spend nothing today and are ravenously hungry by tomorrow, but have more resources for lodging. The mathematics of hunger and shelter are inextricably linked. You're not eating because you want to enjoy food. You're eating because your body requires calories to function, and you're eating whatever is cheapest that won't actively kill you in the immediate term. You're not thinking about arsenic or alum, or the fact that your bread was made with water that contained cholera vibrios. You're just eating and moving on and continuing with the day. So work, if you're lucky enough to find it on this particular morning, begins at the docks when the hiring foreman rings a bell or simply starts pointing at people in the crowd of desperate men hoping for a day's labour. The call-on system, or the call as it's commonly known, is a study in humiliation and economics. Hundreds of men gather each morning hoping to be selected for work that might last 6 hours, or might last the whole day, and they're competing against each other in the most literal sense. The foreman picks who looks strongest, who he recognises from previous days, who he feels like picking. Being picked means food today. Not being picked means your stomach is going to spend the rest of the day filing complaints that you can't adequately address. You arrive at the docks with maybe 200 other men, all standing in loose clusters, all trying to look available and capable. The foreman is a thick-set man with the manner of someone who has never been questioned about his decisions and never will be. He walks through the crowd pointing, you, that one, not you, you. 30 or 40 men are selected, the rest are dismissed. Some of them will try other docks, some will try factories, some will give up and spend the day looking for whatever odd jobs exist, loading carts, moving furniture, cleaning gutters. The casual labour market is vast and dehumanising. If you're selected, you're sent to load grain sacks. The sacks contain roughly 150 pounds of grain. Your job is to carry them from the ship's hold to the warehouse, down the gangplank, or up, depending on direction, and to stack them properly. A good docker will move 30, 40, 50 of these per day, depending on how long the work lasts. Each sack is a 150-pound weight that has to be hoisted onto your shoulder or carried by 2 people simultaneously, depending on your confidence in your own strength. There's no safety equipment, there's no harness, there's no insurance. If you drop a sack on your foot, you're going to have a damaged foot, and you're not being paid to stand around with a damaged foot, so you'll keep working on your damaged foot. And then you'll limp to a doctor, who will probably tell you to apply a poultice of bread and milk, which will do nothing. And the foot will either heal or get infected, and if it gets infected, you'll lose the foot. And if you lose the foot, you can't carry sacks anymore. And if you can't carry sacks, you can't work, and if you can't work, you can't eat. This is the calculation that every docker makes every single time he lifts a sack. Is the immediate danger worth the day's wages? Of course it is, because the alternative is starving. So dockers work through pain. They work through exhaustion. They work through injuries that would be treated immediately in any modern workplace. The mortality rate for dock work isn't tracked very carefully, but the morbidity rate is clear. Dock workers in their 30s look like dock workers in their 50s. The labour tears through your body. You're earning, if you get a full day, maybe 4 or 5 shillings, possibly less if the foreman is particularly exploitative or if there's not enough work. You're paid at the end of the day, cash in hand, which is both good. You can't be cheated of what's already been paid, and bad. The money is immediately exposed to every temptation and scheme to relieve you of it. There are crimps, men who specialise in getting workers drunk and then relieving them of wages by various means. There are gambling games happening constantly. There are women suggesting that time in their company might be worth spending your day's earnings on. If you're not selected by the docks, you might find work in the sweated labour system, factories or workshops, where people manufacture goods at the absolute lowest possible wage. Tailoring is a major one. You might be paid by the piece. A shilling for finishing the cuffs on a dozen shirts, for example. You work in a room with 30 other people, all sitting hunched over, all doing the same repetitive motion, all trying to complete as many pieces as possible because you only get paid for what you complete. The light is poor, windows cost money, and the factory owner is not in the business of spending money on windows. The ventilation is poor. The hours are from 6 in the morning till 9 or 10 at night. You're paid maybe 1 or 2 shillings for the day. The arithmetic is that if you work 13 hours at piece rate, you're earning something less than minimum subsistence, which means you'll do it again tomorrow and the day after, and probably for the rest of your life, unless injury or illness removes you from the equation. Historians still argue whether the sweated labour system was technically exploitative or just the natural result of market competition. The real answer is both, because capitalism doesn't care about the distinction. People need to work. Employers need to keep labour costs low to stay competitive. The result is that wages are pushed to the absolute floor that people will accept before choosing to starve instead. Other options: street sweeping, awful pay, awful conditions, chimney sweeping if you're young and small, like to get stuck and die, hauling water if you're strong, consistent work, terrible pay, selling whatever you can, newspapers, matches, broken items refurbished for the poorest customers. You find work, or you don't. If you do, you work until the light fails or the work runs out. Your muscles ache in ways that you never knew existed. Your hands, if you're not a docker, are bleeding from whatever task you've been assigned. Your back is screaming. And yet, at the end of the day, you have money. And money means you can eat and sleep indoors tonight, which means you'll live to try again tomorrow. By evening, you're exhausted beyond any description you could adequately give. You're sore. You're hungry. You're thinking about the 4p for lodging and whatever's left over for food. You're trying to remember whether you passed a pawn shop, in case you have something you can sell to cover the gap. You're not thinking about the future beyond tonight. The future is too abstract. Right now is concrete. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. The Thames, when you approach it, whether you're at the docks or just wandering through the city toward the bridges, presents itself as a body of water that is absolutely wrong. The smell announces this first, a thick, sulphurous, profoundly unpleasant smell that combines raw sewage, rotting organic matter, industrial chemicals, and things that don't have names because nobody has bothered to identify exactly what's in the water. The water itself is not quite brown, it's a colour that doesn't exist in nature. A murky, sludgy, almost animated brownish grey that suggests that things are actively happening in there, none of them pleasant. In 1858, just 30 years ago, the Thames became so offensive that Parliament literally had to adjourn. The heat of summer made the sewage saturation reach a level where the smell in the city was so overwhelming that business ground to a halt. This became known as the Great Stink, and it was severe enough that action was finally taken. Joseph Bazalgette, a brilliant engineer, was given the task of designing a new sewer system that would take London's sewage away from the city itself and move it downriver, where, theoretically, it would be some other region's problem. The Bazalgette sewer system, completed in the 1860s, is actually an impressive piece of Victorian engineering. It's enormous. Brick tunnels that you could ride a horse through, a system that collected sewage from every building and moved it downstream. The problem is that it moved it to downstream, where it ends up in the Thames, and the Thames is still the primary source of drinking water for large portions of London. So what you've done, essentially, is centralise sewage disposal into a river that is also the water supply, creating a feedback loop of contamination that ensures that diseases related to sewage-contaminated water remain endemic. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery. These are not rare diseases in 1888 London. They're not epidemics in the sense that they break out suddenly. They're persistent. They're woven into the constant background of urban mortality. Children die from them regularly. Adults die from them regularly. The link between contaminated water and disease is now understood, at least by educated people, but the infrastructure to fix it doesn't exist yet. The water supply in your neighbourhood comes from a communal tap. Depending on the neighbourhood, this might be one tap per building, or one tap per several buildings, or in the worst neighbourhoods, one tap per street or per several streets. Everyone collects their daily water from this tap, and everyone knows, on some level, that the water is probably not entirely pure, but you need water. The alternative is to go thirsty, which is not an actual alternative. So you fill your bucket or your pitcher, and you carry it home, and you use it for drinking, cooking and washing, and you don't think too hard about what might be in it. Shared privies are the standard. A building with 40 people sharing 2 or 3 lavatories. The sewage ends up in pits under the building, or if you're slightly more fortunate, it's connected to the Bazalgette system, but privy maintenance is not a high priority. The smell is overwhelming, the sanitary conditions are, let's say, non-existent. People use the privy despite knowing it's going to be horrifying, because the alternative is relieving yourself in the street or your living space, which is somehow even worse. Night soil men are the people who periodically have to empty the privy pits manually. It's the worst job in London, possibly the worst job that exists anywhere. They work at night, hence the name, because the smell is so overwhelming that they can only work when most people are inside and not exposed to it. They're paid extremely poorly because no amount of money makes this actually acceptable work. They dig sewage and excrement out of pits with primitive tools and move it somewhere, ideally to disposal sites, but sometimes it ends up being used as fertiliser for nearby agricultural land, which creates another feedback loop of contamination. Mudlarks are another feature of the Thames ecosystem. These are primarily children and desperate poor who wade in the mud and sewage at the river's edges at low tide, looking for anything salvageable. Nails, pieces of metal, rope, bones, basically anything that might be worth a penny to a junk dealer. They're inhaling the smell of the sludge. They're absorbing contaminated water through their skin. They're finding things in the mud that you cannot unsee. The mortality rate for mudlarks is extremely high, but so is the desperation that drives people to do this work. Water, once you have it, is often stored in open containers in your living space. The bucket sits there, exposed to dust, to smoke, to whatever happens to drift into it. By the time you drink it the next day, it's been sitting overnight accumulating whatever London decides to deposit in it. Boiling water helps, and actually does kill a lot of pathogens, but fuel is expensive, and you need fuel for cooking anyway, so most people just drink the water more or less as it comes. The Thames is not entirely devoid of life. Fish still exist, though not in great abundance and not in great condition. Some fish are edible. Some fish are contaminated enough that eating them is probably not a good idea, but desperation makes that determination challenging. You see the occasional fisherman trying to catch something, and you wonder whether the catch is food or biological hazard. Historians still argue about whether people actually ate Thames fish regularly, or whether it was rare enough that it became legendary. The answer is probably that poor people ate Thames fish sometimes because they needed food and the fish was there, and they either didn't get sick or the sickness was just added to the baseline level of chronic illness that everyone had anyway. The smell of the Thames becomes part of your environment. It's everywhere near the water, and it seeps into your consciousness. You learn to tolerate it the way you learn to tolerate everything else that London does to you. It's just another problem you can't solve, another contamination you can't avoid. You drink the water because you need it to live. You use the privy because you need to defecate. You accept the risk of typhoid the same way you accept the risk of being run over by a horse or of developing silicosis from dusty factory work. These are the terms of existence. You don't negotiate with them. You just live with them until you don't. Movement through London requires either money or incredible patience, and since money is something you barely have, patience becomes your primary transportation strategy. The horse-drawn omnibus is the democratic option, a large bus pulled by 2 horses running established routes through the city, stopping to pick up and drop off passengers at designated spots. A ride costs about a penny for a short distance, maybe 3 pence for a longer cross-city journey. The omnibus is crowded. It's designed to carry maybe 20 people comfortably, but it actually carries 30 or 40 because the conductor doesn't care about comfort. He cares about revenue. You're pressed against other bodies, all of whom are similarly contaminated with coal dust and the general grime of London. The smell is immediate and overwhelming. Multiple unwashed humans, bathing is rare and cold. Someone's pipe smoke, horse manure from the street, and the general miasma of poorly ventilated motion. Windows don't open easily. The air is stale and heavy. If you're sitting on the outer bench, which is cheaper and therefore where working class people sit, you're exposed to the splash of muddy water whenever the omnibus drives through a puddle, and since it's London and it rains constantly, you're going to be splashed. Interior seats are slightly more expensive, but only slightly, and they protect you from the weather. The omnibus is also genuinely dangerous. Horses are unpredictable, and the drivers are often reckless. Somewhere between 300 and 400 people are killed by horse traffic every year in London. That includes accidents with wagons, carts, carriages and omnibuses. You get on an omnibus and you're accepting a small but genuine chance of being either killed or severely injured. People accept this because the alternative is walking, which is slower, which costs time, which might cost money through lost work opportunities. The Underground, the most modern transportation miracle of Victorian London, opened in 1863 and is expanding. It's an extraordinary achievement. Trains running underground, powered by steam engines, moving people rapidly through the city. The problem is that it's filled with smoke. The steam trains in the tunnels can't exhaust effectively, so the tunnels fill with smoke that has nowhere to go. You descend into the Underground and you're descending into a landscape of murk and heat and steam and fumes. People who ride the Underground regularly develop a characteristic cough. The stations themselves are suffocatingly hot in summer, and the platforms are covered in a thin layer of coal dust that, when disturbed, rises into the air as a black cloud. That said, the Underground is faster than walking, and it moves more people more efficiently than the omnibus, so despite its absolute unpleasantness, it's gaining popularity. A ticket might cost 2 pence, which is expensive enough that working people primarily use the omnibus or walk. But for people with slightly more money, the Underground is the future. Walking is actually the primary mode of transportation for the working poor. You walk to work, you walk home, you walk to the market, to the pub, to the church. If you go to church, many working people don't because churches tend to make you feel bad about being poor. You walk through the fog, through the rain, through the cold, because walking is free and you have time, even if you don't have money. Your shoes, if you're lucky, are adequate. If you're unlucky, they leak, or they're falling apart, or they don't exist and you're walking on cold cobblestone with bare feet that are gradually developing thick calluses and open sores simultaneously. During fog, walking becomes significantly more complicated. The fog is thick enough that you can't see more than a few yards ahead. But London still needs to function. People still need to get to work. The city has developed an informal system of guides, link boys. These are typically young people, usually boys, who carry torches or lanterns and offer to guide you through the fog for a penny or so. They know the streets. They can navigate by memory even when visibility is completely zero. You hire a link boy and you follow the light, and eventually you get to your destination. It's an oddly poignant system. The link boy economy is entirely dependent on the fog, and the fog is a constant feature of London life, so the link boys are always in demand. It's one of the few ways that young people without any other prospects can earn consistent small amounts of money. Link boys are a feature of Victorian London in a way that seems almost romantic from distance. The young person with the torch, guiding the lost traveller through the fog. The reality is that it's a desperate system necessitated by the fact that the air is so contaminated that you literally cannot see to navigate at certain times of year. Traffic, when you encounter it on the streets, is a constant negotiation between carts, horses, omnibuses, individual travellers, and occasionally a carriage belonging to someone with money. There are no traffic laws, there are no traffic lights. There are traffic police in major intersections, wearing distinctive uniforms and using hand signals, trying to keep the chaos organised, but they're fighting a losing battle because there's no agreed-upon set of rules. You move through the traffic by being aware, by being nimble, by accepting that you might get hit by a cart, and if you do, that's just how it goes. People get hit. Horses trample pedestrians. Carts crush things under their wheels. Drivers shout. Pedestrians curse. It's an absolutely chaotic system that somehow functions through a combination of luck, quick reflexes, and mutual understanding that everyone is trying not to die. Historians still argue whether the sheer number of traffic deaths was a major driver of attitudes toward public health reform, or whether it was mostly considered an inevitable part of urban life, and therefore not particularly prioritised. The answer is probably both. It was inevitable, and therefore not prioritised, but that didn't make it less terrible, just more accepted. By evening, your feet hurt. Your legs ache from walking. If you've been on an omnibus, you reek of smoke and sweat and horse manure. The distances you've covered are significant. London is a sprawling city, and getting from one end to the other can take hours. Tomorrow you'll do it again unless you can find work in your neighbourhood, which is unlikely because neighbourhoods cluster by profession, and you might live nowhere near available labour. The neighbourhood you're walking through, assuming you're in one of the genuinely poor areas, and not just a working class area, there's a distinction, is a collection of courts and tenements that defy all modern understanding of habitation. These are the Rookeries, areas so densely packed and so thoroughly degraded that they exist almost outside normal Victorian society. They're described in contemporary accounts with a kind of horrified fascination, as if the writer is documenting an alien civilization that happens to exist in central London. A typical court is accessed through a narrow alley, maybe 8 feet wide, maybe less. The court itself is a rectangular space surrounded on all sides by buildings, creating an internal yard area perhaps 30 feet by 40 feet. Into this space, approximately 600 people might live. That's roughly 600 people per acre, which is more densely packed than modern Manhattan at its densest. These are not temporary populations. These are people living there because they have nowhere else to go, and they're paying rent to a landlord who owns the entire court, and is extracting maximum revenue from every inch of it. The buildings around the court are typically 4 or 5 stories tall, subdivided into rooms that might be 10 feet by 12 feet, renting for maybe 3 shillings per week. A family, typically 7 or 8 people, lives in one of these rooms. They sleep there, they cook there, on a small charcoal stove if they have access to one, in the hearth if they don't. They store their possessions there. Children are born there. People die there. The window, if there is one, opens into the court, where 40 other windows open into the same court, and the light barely penetrates more than 1 floor up from the bottom. The communal tap in the centre of the court supplies water for everyone. During morning and evening rush times, queues form with people waiting their turn to fill their buckets. The tap sometimes doesn't work. When it doesn't work, you have to walk to another court to find another tap, or you have to buy water from water carriers, who charge a premium for delivering it to you. The toilet facilities are primitive, a series of privies at the edge of the court, badly maintained, absolutely insufficient for the population. The hotbed system is most prevalent here, Families share beds because there aren't enough beds for everyone to sleep. Someone works the night shift, someone else sleeps during the night. They share the same bed, alternating shifts. The bed is never cold. The bedding never has a chance to dry. This creates an ideal environment for certain parasites and infections. Scabies spreads through communal bedding like a pervasive itch that nobody can quite escape. Lice are universal. Fleas are expected. These aren't seen as hygiene failures, but as natural features of existing in this density. The smell of a court is overwhelming. It combines human sewage, the privies are regularly overflowing, decaying food waste, coal smoke, unwashed bodies, mildew, and an ineffable sense of despair. First-time visitors to Rookeries often become physically ill just from the smell. Residents become accustomed to it in the way that humans become accustomed to everything. It's just background. Crime in the Rookeries is a complex issue. There's petty theft, constant, almost ambient. There's violence, regular, mostly directed inward within the community. There's also an informal economy, people helping each other, sharing resources, creating social structures that allow survival. A woman might take care of the children of a woman who's working, in exchange for some food or some money. A man might help repair a room in exchange for something. It's not charity, it's economics in its purest form, trading what you have for what you need. The photograph on the mantelpiece, if there is a mantelpiece, which there might not be because there's barely a wall that qualifies as peace, would show ancestors, would show a previous era when someone in the family might have had a slightly better situation. Photographs are expensive, so if they exist, they're treasured. They're taken out and looked at carefully. They represent better times, or at least different times. Historians still argue whether the Rookeries were breeding grounds for social revolution, or whether people were too exhausted by the basic requirements of survival to organise politically. The answer is probably both. Some people did organise, did protest, did try to change their situation, and most people were just trying to get through the day without dying or losing their children to disease. Children born in the Rookeries have an infant mortality rate that hovers around 40 or 50%. Half of all children born will not reach their 5th birthday. You might have 6 children, and only 3 of them survive to adulthood. This is not remarked upon as a tragedy. It's accepted as inevitable. Children's funerals are handled efficiently. Children's graves are often shared graves in pauper burial grounds where they're packed in multiple per burial plot. Work for people living in the Rookeries is even more precarious than for working-class people in less dense areas. You're competing with hundreds of other people for the same jobs. The call-on system at the docks is even more brutal when there are hundreds of men instead of dozens. Your wages are correspondingly lower because there's always someone willing to work for less. Entertainment, if it exists, is cheap and desperate. Pubs provide heat and light and a beer for maybe a penny. They're crowded and loud and filled with people talking about their shared misery, which is paradoxically comforting. Music halls put on shows for a few pence, offering distraction from reality. Betting shops allow people to dream about winning large sums of money, which almost never happens. But the hope is still less expensive than actually improving your situation. By night, the court transforms into a dense darkness lit by occasional gas lights. The sounds of the court continue, crying children, arguing adults, coughing that echoes off the close buildings, occasionally music from a pub, or the sound of someone being roughly dealt with as discipline or payment for debts. It's a civilization unto itself, operating according to rules that make sense only within the context of absolute desperation and density. Illness in 1888 London is the real killer, far more dangerous than violence, more probable than accident, more inevitable than any other cause of mortality. Medical care, such as it exists for poor people, is an exercise in hope more than effectiveness, and frequently the hope is misplaced. The chemist shop is your first stop for anything medical. You don't go to a doctor unless you're absolutely desperate because doctors charge money and you don't have money. The chemist sells patent medicines, things with names like Dr. Collis Brown's Chlorodyne, or Beecham's Pills, or simply Cure-All Tonic, which are almost entirely unregulated and almost universally ineffective. Some are actively harmful. The active ingredient in many of these medicines is laudanum, essentially opium dissolved in alcohol. Laudanum is available over the counter. You can just walk into any chemist, or even some grocery stores, and buy it. It's cheap, it's effective at dulling pain. It's also addictive, and it can kill you if you take too much. But the particular genius of laudanum is that it works for basically everything: pain, anxiety, insomnia, diarrhea, the general anxiety of being alive in London in 1888. People use it regularly. Parents give it to children. A teething baby might be dosed with laudanum to stop the crying, and the dosing might exceed what's safe for an infant, and the infant might die, but that's just an accident, not criminal. Laudanum addiction is real and common, but it's not seen as a moral failure or a medical problem. It's just what happens when people use medicine. The dependency doesn't matter if you can afford the drug. If you can't, you suffer withdrawal, which is unpleasant and sometimes dangerous, but again, this is seen as an individual problem, not a systematic issue. Other over-the-counter preparations might contain arsenic, which is marketed for various conditions despite being poisonous. Mercury is used to treat syphilis, and while it sometimes actually works, it also causes your teeth to fall out and various other complications. Bloodletting is still practiced. The idea that removing some of your blood might cure your illness by balancing your humours. It doesn't work. It actually makes things worse. But it's traditional and it's done. If you're desperate enough to see an actual doctor, you'll find someone who's probably been trained reasonably well if they're a proper physician, but there are also bone setter and folk practitioners who have no formal training and are essentially operating on intuition and tradition. Lister's antiseptic principles, the revolutionary idea that sterilization prevents infection, have been published and are known in medical circles, but they haven't yet become universal practice. Some hospitals practice antisepsis. Many don't because it requires purchasing disinfectants and changing techniques, and most hospitals are more interested in moving people through quickly than in actually treating them effectively. Hospital conditions, if you end up in one, are grim. Hospitals are places where injured and dying people congregate, where infection is rampant, where the mortality rate for people who enter is often higher than for people who stay home. You go to a hospital if you have nowhere else to be, and you hope you don't develop a secondary infection that will kill you faster than whatever brought you there in the first place. For minor ailments, people rely on home remedies that are mostly ineffective, but occasionally actually work through pure accident. A bread and milk poultice applied to a boil might help because the heat does something beneficial, even if the bread and milk themselves are useless. A dirty sock applied to a wound, which was actually a documented remedy, would be bacteria-laden and therefore actively harmful, but somehow some people survived anyway, and that survival was interpreted as evidence that the remedy worked. Willow bark actually contains salicylic acid, which is the active ingredient in aspirin, so traditional willow bark remedies actually did provide pain relief, which then reinforced the belief in the remedy even though the mechanism wasn't understood. Toothache was genuinely dangerous. A tooth could become infected. The infection could spread into the jaw and face, and you could die from it. Tooth extraction was the common solution, and the extraction was done by barber surgeons using tools that were nominally sterilized but probably weren't. The pain of extraction was significant. Anesthesia was available. Chloroform or ether, but many dentists didn't use it because it cost money and took time. You just endured the extraction. People died from post-extraction infection regularly. Tuberculosis was the signature disease of the era. It was called consumption or phthisis, and it killed enormous numbers of people. It presents as a persistent cough, weight loss, and eventually death. It's romantic in literature, pale, wasting, poetic. In reality, it's horrifying. You're coughing up blood, you're sweating through your clothes at night, you're slowly starving because you can't eat, and there's nothing anyone can do about it except tell you to get rest and fresh air. The air in London is neither fresh nor restorative, so tuberculosis patients pretty much just die. Cholera outbreaks still occur, though less frequently after the water supply improvements. When cholera comes, it's catastrophic. Sudden violent diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration, death within hours. People don't understand it's waterborne because that's not intuitive. They think it's spread through the air through miasma. Prevention is thus ineffective. Treatment is fluids, which helps, but if you're too poor to have access to clean water, the fluids you get might make things worse. Historians still argue whether the infant mortality rate was accepted as inevitable, or whether it drove medical and public health reform. The answer is both. It was accepted as inevitable, and yet the sheer awfulness of it did push reform agendas, and some people did die of things that are now easily preventable. Pregnancy and childbirth are genuinely dangerous. Childbed fever kills women regularly. Pregnancy itself causes complications that kill. Infants are born and many don't survive the first week. A woman might have 6 pregnancies and only 3 of the children survive, and she considers this a successful outcome because she still has the 3. You don't think about illness as a statistical probability. You think about it as something that might happen. If it does happen, you try to manage it with what's available. If what's available doesn't work, you suffer and possibly die. That's just how survival works. It's hard and it's unpredictable, and there's not much you can do about it except keep going until you can't anymore. You've heard the warnings your whole life, whispered like incantations to keep you obedient. Go to the workhouse and you'll never come out the same. Now you stand outside the grim brick edifice on Whitechapel Road, 4 stories of relentless geometry, and every fibre of your exhausted body screams at you to turn around and walk into the Thames instead. The wind carries the sound of voices, not joyful, not even angry, just rhythmic and hollow, and you realise that's the sound of 100 people who've had the individuality beaten out of them like wrinkles from a coat. The workhouse is where the poor law sends you when you've run out of options, when your 4p hasn't stretched far enough, and the lodging house keeper won't trust you for another night. It's the institution that was supposed to solve poverty, the New Poor Law of 1834. That brilliant stroke of policy that decided the solution was to make being destitute so unattractive that people would simply choose not to be poor. Genius, really, in the way that stabbing yourself to cure a headache is genius. The principle is called less eligibility, which is a fancy way of saying life in the workhouse must be worse than the worst-paying job outside so that only the truly desperate would consider it. You shuffle through the entrance and immediately everything you own is taken from you. Your clothes disappear into a storage room. You won't see them again unless you leave, and you'll never leave. Instead, they dress you in workhouse uniform, rough wool that smells of carbolic soap and institutional decay, dyed an unfortunate shade of grey that seems calculated to make everyone look like a ghost of themselves. Then comes your number. You're no longer whatever name your mother gave you. You're now a number stitched into your uniform, as if the workhouse administrators realised that stripping your clothes wasn't quite thorough enough in the dismantling of personhood. The regime begins immediately. You're woken at 6 a.m. by a bell that sounds like it's announcing the end of the world. Breakfast is thin gruel. Not unpleasant exactly, just relentlessly unnourishing, like eating enthusiasm, and then you're assigned your task. Yours, it seems, is oakum picking, which is the kind of job that makes you understand why the Victorians felt comfortable consigning the poor to slow psychological torture while calling it rehabilitation. Oakum picking, in case you've somehow avoided this particular circle of hell, is the process of taking old tarred rope that's been sitting in salt water and sun for years, and unpicking it, fibre by fibre, until it becomes a kind of stringy, useless substance that no one actually wants. The tar gets under your fingernails. The salt stings every tiny cut you get, and you get hundreds of them. You're assigned a quota. You must pick a certain weight of oakum each day, and if you don't meet it, you don't eat. This ensures that even the physical labour of the workhouse is designed to be just barely possible. A cruel calculus of deprivation that keeps you on the knife's edge between exhaustion and starvation. Historians still argue whether the workhouse system was genuinely believed to be reformative by its architects, or whether it was simply a cost-saving measure dressed in moral language, and frankly, the distinction doesn't matter much when your fingers are bleeding. The silence at meals is enforced with an intensity that borders on the supernatural. You sit at long tables with hundreds of other workhouse inmates, and you don't speak, not a word. A supervisor walks between the rows, watching for the slightest infraction. You've heard whispers, during the brief time when speaking was permitted, about an old man who was flogged for smiling at breakfast. Whether it's true or not, the story does its job. Everyone eats in absolute silence, scraping their spoons against their bowls, and that's the only sound except for the occasional creak of the building settling into its own misery. Children are separated from parents here. They're removed the moment intake is complete, sent to a different ward where they sleep in dormitories and receive what's optimistically called education, mostly learning to be obedient and less than human. You see a woman try to follow her daughter as they're being separated, and a workhouse official, a man with the joyless efficiency of someone who's perfected the art of cruelty, simply stands in her way. No drama, no raised voices, just bureaucratic absence of compassion. The woman stops, defeated by the sheer institutional gravity of the thing, and you realise you're witnessing someone's will being fractured in real time. Your workhouse uniform feels heavier each day. By the second week you can't remember your name clearly anymore. You're your number. You're the sharp pain in your fingers, the ache in your spine from hunching over rope. The perpetual hunger, the silence that feels less like imposed quiet and more like the absence of your own voice. The institution has become less a place and more a process, a slow erasure of everything that made you a person rather than a problem to be managed. You wake one morning in the dormitory, 8 beds to a room, thin blankets that don't quite reach your feet, and you make a decision. Not today, not ever. You look at the other faces around you, already wearing the glassy look of the permanently institutionalized, and you understand that if you stay much longer, you won't be able to leave. The workhouse won't have to keep you. You'll simply choose to stay because the thought of existing outside will have become too foreign. So you wait for the morning chaos, the bell, the march to the dining hall, the careful confusion of moving 100 people through narrow corridors, and you slip away. You don't have your clothes. You don't have a plan. All you have is the absolute certainty that whatever waits for you outside is better than what's waiting for you in here. You step out into Whitechapel Road in your workhouse grey, and you make yourself a promise. You'll sleep in the streets. You'll eat scraps. You'll do whatever needs doing, but you'll never go back inside those walls. Never. The streets at night are a different animal entirely, and you're learning its habits the hard way. The workhouse escape was 4 days ago, and you're still shaky from it, still jumping at shadows, still checking your pockets every 5 minutes even though there's nothing in them to steal, which is lucky because the thieves working these streets are unnervingly professional about their work. They call themselves dips, and they operate in coordinated teams with the precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra. One person brushes past you, maybe they stumble, apologise, move on, while their partner is already lifting your watch or cutting your purse strings with a razor blade. By the time you've realised you've been robbed, they're 3 streets over, the stolen item already passed to a third member of the team who's heading for a fence in a basement somewhere. You've had it happen to you twice now, and both times you didn't realise until hours later. The second time, you didn't even have anything worth stealing, which somehow felt more insulting than the first. The Metropolitan Police H Division is supposed to patrol these streets, maintain order, catch criminals. What they actually do is maintain a theatre of law-keeping that's undermanned, underfunded, and fundamentally unable to cope with the scale of crime happening right in front of them. There are only about 200 policemen covering the entire East End, which means that in any given hour, there are probably thousands of criminals doing something illegal within a stone's throw of an officer. The mathematics are horrifying if you think about them too hard. And they are doing terrible things because there's an actual hierarchy to the criminal economy of London. At the top are the fences, the ones who handle stolen property, who have connections and property, who rarely get their hands dirty. Below them are the burglars who operate at night, who know how to move through a house without being heard, who can identify valuables and know exactly which items are easiest to move. Then there are the garroters, the ones who'll strangle you from behind in an alleyway and take whatever's on your person. The petty thieves, the dips you just fell victim to, are actually below the garroters in terms of class hierarchy within the criminal world, which is remarkably detailed for a system that technically doesn't exist. And then there are the screevers, the forgers. You met one in a pub last week, or rather you bought a drink for someone who was a screever, though you didn't know it at the time. He was offering references, perfect copies of the written recommendations that employers might require. Need to prove you worked somewhere for 3 months? He'll write it for you, make it look official, forge a signature. Need to claim you left a previous job in good standing. He's got a whole system worked out. Historians still argue whether the volume of forged references was significant enough to actually impact employment hiring, or whether it was more of a cultural anxiety made manifest. But either way, the fact that screevers exist at all tells you something about how broken the system is when people are desperate enough to create entire fake identities just to get hired. Walking home at night has become an art form you're learning against your will. You stick to the well-lit areas when possible, though the gaslit pools of light in the streets can be as dangerous as the shadows. You stay in the middle of the street, away from dark alleyways and shop doorways. You keep your hand on whatever you have of value, and try to look poor enough that it's not worth robbing you, but not so poor that you're obviously desperate enough to be an easy mark. A careful calibration that never quite works out the way you plan it. The darkness is different here than anywhere else in London. The wealthy districts to the west have more gas lamps, brighter illumination, more police presence. Here, there are stretches of 3 or 4 streets where the darkness is absolute, punctuated only by the occasional sickly glow from a gin palace window or the red end of a cigarette. Pools of shadow wait between lampposts like predators. You move from light to light, and in the darkness between them, you're acutely aware that you're not the only person using this street. There's someone else in the shadows, maybe someone with a blade, maybe someone with nothing to lose. That paranoia, you're realizing, isn't something that happens to you out of nowhere. It's rational adaptation. It's survival strategy. Every person you pass might be planning to rob you. Every footstep behind you might be someone with violent intent. Every hand that gets near you in a crowd might be holding a cutting tool. It sounds exhausting because it is exhausting, but it's also the baseline assumption that keeps you alive. The moment you stop being paranoid, the moment you let your guard down even slightly, is the moment someone takes what little you have left. You've started recognizing faces, not names, just faces. The young woman who works 3 of the dips as a team, always wearing a green ribbon in her hair. The garroter they call Crusher, massive and slow but effective because he moves with the absolute certainty of someone who knows how violence works. The fence Mr. Thatcher, always clean and well dressed, always emerging from a basement somewhere with a parcel, is like you're learning the roster of a particularly dangerous theatre company, and the stage is these streets, and none of you are getting out alive. You've also started to notice which constables are actually attempting to do their jobs, and which ones are just going through the motions. Some of them will actually interfere if they see a crime happening. Most of them will simply move along. One officer in particular, a tall man with a scarred cheek, seems to actively work against the criminals, making arrests, following up on reports. You've seen dips actively avoid his patrol route. Even within the undermanned, ineffective system, there's variation, and that variation is your only protection. The 4p you managed to earn washing clothes at a private house last week is gone now. You spent it on bread and a bed in a different lodging house, one that's supposed to be marginally cleaner than the last. But you know, the money will always be gone, will always disappear into the immediate needs of survival, and that's the trap that keeps people cycling through these streets forever. August arrives with a hot, sticky dread that has nothing to do with the weather. There's a killer loose in Whitechapel, and unlike the ordinary criminals who maintain a certain operational logic, this one appears to have abandoned logic entirely. You hear about it first from a shopkeeper's boy who tells everyone who'll listen. A woman named Martha Tabram has been found dead on the stairs of a building, multiple stab wounds, and though no one will say it explicitly, the implication is clear. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something else. By September, there are 2 more. Emma Smith and Ada Wilson in early September, though those are sometimes debated as connected. But then come the ones that nobody debates. Mary Ann Nichols in Bucks Row, found lying in a puddle of blood with her skirts up and her throat cut so deeply that she's almost severed. Then Annie Chapman just 2 weeks later, disemboweled in a yard behind a house, organs missing. The details get worse with each victim, or maybe they just get more elaborate as people retell them, exaggerating with each iteration until you can't quite tell where the truth ends and the terror begins. Catherine Eddowes arrives at the mortuary with her throat cut and her left kidney removed. Mary Jane Kelly, the last and most brutalised, is found in her room looking like something has taken human form and forgotten how to be human in the process. 5 women, the canonical victims as people start calling them, with the detached vocabulary of people trying to create order out of chaos. 5 victims and nobody knows who's doing it, which is almost as terrifying as if everyone knew. The penny press is having the time of its life. Every newspaper in London suddenly discovers that they can sell thousands of extra copies by dedicating page after page to the murders, the speculation, the increasingly wild theories. The killer becomes famous, becomes a symbol, becomes a focus of attention that's almost as addictive as the violence itself. Someone gets a letter claiming to be from the killer, the Dear Boss letter, and suddenly everyone thinks they know what the killer is thinking, as if you could read someone's mind through a letter that's probably written by a journalist anyway. The police force collapses under the pressure. There's a jurisdictional mess that would be comical if it weren't so horrifying. Some areas are patrolled by Scotland Yard, some by the Metropolitan Police, some by the City Police, and nobody's sure who's supposed to be in charge when a murder happens in certain areas. This means that the killer can operate in the cracks between jurisdictions, can move from one administrative area to another, can outsmart the authorities simply by existing in the liminal spaces they've created. You notice that the women have changed. The ones who work these streets, the unfortunate women as they're called, with a delicacy that's actually more insulting than the alternative, are terrified now in a way that's more profound than paranoia. You see it in the way they move, in the way their eyes dart constantly toward shadows, in the way they've stopped pretending that they have any control over their situation. Several of them have stopped leaving their rooms at night entirely, which means they've also stopped making money, which means they're spiraling towards something worse than death. In the worst moments, you wonder if you're at risk. You're young, you're fit enough, you could theoretically be mistaken for someone of a certain unfortunate profession if you're not careful about where you walk and who you're seen with. You're not at anywhere near the risk level of the women being targeted, but you're close enough that the anxiety brushes against you. The suspects multiply like rumours, over 100 by some counts, rich men and poor men, doctors and butchers, and an increasingly elaborate mythology of potential killers that says more about Victorian anxieties than it does about the actual killer. There's the theory that it's a deranged surgeon, because of the anatomical knowledge suggested by the removal of organs. There's the theory that it's a foreign sailor, because xenophobia is apparently eternal. There's the theory that it's someone respectable, someone with status and connections, who's being protected by institutional forces because they matter and the victims don't. Historians still argue whether the 5 canonical victims represent the actual work of a single killer, or whether they've become conflated through the process of media sensationalism and collective memory construction. And the truth is that it doesn't really matter, because the fear is real, and the fear has consequences that ripple through the streets like blood in water. The fear is physical in the streets now. It lives in the lampposts and the alleyways. It lives in the moment before you turn a corner, in the moment when you hear footsteps behind you, in the moment when any man becomes a potential murderer and any dark space becomes a possible tomb. The lodging houses are fuller than ever. Women paying for beds because they can't bring themselves to be outside after dark. The pubs are louder, filled with nervous energy, with people talking about the murders, speculating, performing theories, as if the act of talking about the killer might somehow contain him. You're sitting in one of these pubs, nursing a small beer that cost you a portion of your hard-earned money, and you hear someone say with absolute certainty that the killer is definitely a Jew, which is apparently the new prevailing theory because one of the victims was found near a chalk mark with writing that might or might not constitute an anti-Semitic comment depending on who's interpreting it. You watch the anti-Semitic sentiment spread through the room like infection, and you realise that the killer, whoever he is, has already fractured the entire community along lines of fear and prejudice and blame. By November, the murders stop. Nobody knows why. Maybe he's dead. Maybe he's left London. Maybe he never existed as a single person, and the whole thing was mass hysteria given form. What you know for certain is that he's left something behind. A scar on the city, a distrust of shadows, a permanent elevation of fear in these streets. The women are still terrified. The police are still humiliated. And you're still walking these streets at night because you have nowhere else to go, jumping at shadows, acutely aware that evil, whatever shape it takes, is real and present and could emerge from anywhere. If the workhouse is the lower circle of institutional hell and the streets are where you learn to be paranoid, then the pub is where you learn to be human again, or at least where you learn to forget that you're not. There are roughly 100,000 licensed drinking establishments in London. Pubs, gin palaces, beer houses, and various other establishments whose primary purpose is to provide liquid forgetting, and you're becoming intimately familiar with several of them in your neighbourhood. The pub you frequent most is the Dram on Brick Lane, which is neither fancy nor particularly clean, but which has several crucial advantages. The keeper doesn't water down the beer as aggressively as some places do. There's usually someone playing a violin or singing in the corner, and most importantly, you can order a pint of porter for a penny. 1 penny. For the price of nothing, you can sit for hours, warm from the heat of the packed bodies and the small fire in the back, and pretend that you're not homeless, that you have a place in the world, that society has included you rather than ejected you. The gin palaces are something different entirely. You've only ventured into 1 or 2 of them. They're not designed for people like you, but the sheer architectural aggression of them is worth documenting in your mind. They're these vast gleaming temples to drinking, with plate glass windows so large that you can see the glittering interior from the street, with gilded lettering announcing their names in letters the size of your head, with marble bars and brass fittings that cost more than you'll ever earn in your entire lifetime. The implicit message is clear: this is not for poor people, even though poor people can afford the drinks. The architecture itself is a form of humiliation. Inside one of these places, you went in once to use the toilet and a barkeeper didn't actively throw you out. You see people of relative wealth standing shoulder to shoulder with people like you, all brought together in this glittering space by the need for alcohol. The woman next to you at the bar is clearly of a certain unfortunate profession. The man across from her is clearly a gentleman. Neither of them is paying any attention to the other, both lost in their own thoughts, their own reasons for needing to be anywhere but where they actually are. The temperance movement has been screaming about all of this for decades. The demonic nature of alcohol, the way it destroys families, the way it perpetuates poverty, and they're not entirely wrong. You've seen what alcohol does to people. You've watched men drink away their last shilling and then sit in the gutter wondering where their money went. You've seen women choose drinking over eating because at least alcohol numbs the hunger. But the temperance people have also never tried to live on 4p a day while working 10 hours for it. So their moral certainty rings a bit hollow when you're standing in a gin palace using a penny's worth of alcohol to extend your sense of belonging by another hour. What the temperance advocates don't understand is that the pub isn't actually about the alcohol. It's a living room. It's the only space where working people have access to heat, light, and community without having to earn enough money for rent. It's where people sit and forget the fact that they have nothing, that they're nothing, that tomorrow they might be dead and nobody will care. The alcohol is just the mechanism by which you're permitted to exist in a space designed for human connection. You've heard about the twopenny hangover, the practice of some pubs where for 2p you can sleep sitting up at the bar, your arms resting on the counter for several hours. It sounds like hell, and it probably is, but it's also a roof of sorts, it's also shelter, it's also a claim on a small piece of space in a city that doesn't want to acknowledge your existence. Some nights you consider trying it, pooling your coins, committing to a few hours of miserable half-sleep in exchange for not being entirely outside. The music in the pubs is almost as important as the alcohol. There's usually someone, maybe a man with a violin, maybe someone with a mouth organ, maybe just someone with a decent voice, performing for tips. The songs are usually about the East End itself, songs that acknowledge the reality of the lives being lived in these streets. Songs about lost love and poverty and the small rebellions of working people. You hear a beautiful singer one night, a woman with a voice that carries above the noise of dozens of conversations, singing a ballad about a young man gone to war who never came home, and the entire room goes quiet. Even the drunk men stop talking. Even the hardened criminals pause in their schemes. Everyone is listening to this woman sing about loss, about longing, about the permanent absence that defines so many lives. When she finishes, the room seems to collectively remember that it's alive and money gets pressed into her hand. Coins people probably needed for rent, given willingly because in that moment the song mattered more than survival. This is entertainment for people who have almost nothing. This is community for people who officially don't exist in respectable society. This is warmth, literal and metaphorical, in a city that's trying very hard to freeze you out. You've noticed something interesting about the pub keepers. Some of them actually care. Some of them will extend credit to people they know, will let someone sleep in the back on a particularly cold night, will water down the beer slightly less for customers they like. There's an economy of small kindnesses happening underneath the capitalism of the transaction. It's not charity. Nobody wants charity. But it's a recognition that these are human beings with legitimate needs, and that creates a different kind of relationship than what you get from most of society. The law looks at this and sees a problem. The authorities view the pub as a den of moral corruption, a place where the poor are encouraged to spend their meagre wages on drink rather than saving for moral improvement. They propose restricting pub hours, raising taxes on alcohol, creating regulations that would make drinking less accessible. What they miss is that if you took away the pubs, you'd be taking away the only refuge a lot of these people have, the only place where they're treated as people rather than problems. So you've become a regular at the Dram. The keeper knows your face now, or at least he's stopped actively avoiding your gaze. You have a rough idea of which nights have music, which nights are quieter, which patrons might share a drink with you if you buy them one. You've created a tiny, fragile society here, made of 2p and human decency, and the shared understanding that everyone in this room is avoiding something. Tommy is 7 years old, though he looks like he might be 5 and acts like he might be 9, and his entire job in life is sweeping the crossings. You see him most mornings at the corner of Commercial Street and Whitechapel Road, a small figure wielding a broom almost as tall as he is. pushing accumulated dirt and dung and the residue of urban living into piles that exactly nobody wants him to create. He's paid, sometimes by people crossing the street, a penny or two or nothing at all depending on his luck and the generosity of the day's foot traffic. He's one of thousands of child street workers in London, maybe 30,000, according to the estimates that Barnardo's keeps publishing. You don't know Barnardo personally. He's this wealthy philanthropist who's trying to do something about the situation, but his estimate probably doesn't even account for all of them, because he's counting the ones he knows about, the ones who are visible, not the ones like Tommy who've become so much a part of the urban landscape that you stop noticing they're there. Then there are the flower sellers from Covent Garden, girls barely double Tommy's age, carrying flowers or selling them. Mostly selling them, actually, because the flowers are credit, and if they don't sell enough, they're in debt to whoever supplied them. You see them in the evening, still holding their inventory when the flower markets are closing, desperation starting to creep into their sales pitch, because they need to convert those flowers into coins before the day ends or they'll owe money overnight. The mudlarks are more organised. Boys, mostly, who work the Thames at low tide, searching through the mud for things that have been lost or discarded. Coal, nails, bits of metal, anything that might be sold for a few pence. They're territorial about it, which is actually kind of impressive in its own way. Different groups control different sections of riverbank, and there's an actual hierarchy, an actual structure to their economy. You've heard about conflicts over territory, about boys getting beat up for scavenging in the wrong stretch of water. All of them are supposed to be in school, technically. The Education Act of 1880 theoretically requires children to attend school, which was supposed to be this revolutionary idea, free education for everyone, until it became clear that free education and enforcing attendance were two entirely different things. There are board men, attendance officers, who are supposed to find truant children and drag them into schooling, but they're as undermanned as the police, and they have about as much hope of actually changing anything. You've seen a boardman in action exactly once, watching him try to grab a boy who was clearly not interested in attending school, and the boy was faster and smaller and essentially disappeared into an alleyway like water through a sieve. The boardman didn't pursue very vigorously. Historians still argue whether the Education Act of 1880 was genuinely transformative in terms of literacy rates, or whether its impact was minimal given the resistance and underfunding. But from your perspective on the street, it seems like the law exists to make respectable people feel like they're solving a problem while actually solving nothing. The pure finders are a special category of child labour that you learn about with a mixture of horror and bewilderment at human ingenuity. These are children, usually around 7 or 8, in the prime age for actually fitting into tight spaces and having the desperation to do terrible things, who search the streets for dog excrement. Specifically, they collect it, because dog shit, or pure as it's called with a euphemism that doesn't make it less gross, is actually valuable. It's used in the tanning process, and tanners will pay a few pence per bucket for it. So these children, these 7-year-old children, spend their days hunting for dog feces in London streets, filling buckets with it, and selling it to tanners. It's not the worst thing you've heard of. That distinction probably belongs to the things you've heard rumours about but don't want to contemplate. Children in certain living situations where the line between exploitation and abuse becomes theoretical rather than practical. But it's close enough that you find yourself actively not thinking about the pure finders most of the time, because thinking about them requires thinking about the absolute depth of poverty, about the way capitalism will find something, literally anything, even excrement, that can be monetized if it means extracting value from people with nothing. You've gotten to know Tommy a bit. He's the crossing sweeper at your regular corner, and after a month or so he stopped scattering away when you approached. You bought him a bread roll one afternoon when you had a few extra pence, and now he seems to expect a greeting when he sees you. He's told you about his mother, who works at a laundry and leaves before dawn and comes back after dark with hands that look like she's been slowly boiling them. He's told you about his sister, who also works, in some capacity he's vague about. He's never mentioned a father, and you don't ask. The worst part is that Tommy's probably better off than a lot of children you see. He has a mother who tries, a job that provides at least some income, a connection to the formal economy rather than the purely desperate improvisation that some children exist in. The worst part is that the baseline of better off in this context means you're still a 7-year-old pushing filth around the streets instead of playing with toys or attending school or doing any of the things that a child should theoretically be doing. You're developing a theory about London. It's a city that consumes children. Not violently, not in one dramatic event, but gradually, systematically, turning childhood into labour and love into strategy and growth into deprivation. Every child you see on these streets is being converted into something smaller than a person, some kind of economic unit with a price attached, and nobody, not the authorities, not respectable society, not even most of the parents who love these children, seems to be able to stop it. You've started noticing a pattern to the charitable impulses of London. There's the Salvation Army, which arrived in a burst of enthusiasm and brass band noise about 20 years ago, founded by William and Catherine Booth, a couple with a kind of absolute conviction that makes you either want to follow them religiously or run in the opposite direction as fast as your legs will carry you. You're somewhere in between, watching them with curiosity and skepticism in equal measure. The Salvation Army shows up where respectable Christianity doesn't want to go. They work in the slums, they live among poor people, they actually seem to believe in the theological concept of loving your neighbour, which is apparently controversial among people who go to nicer churches. They've got a military structure, generals and soldiers and uniforms, which at first seemed ridiculous to you until you realised it was probably intentional, creating a sense of purpose and belonging for people who officially don't belong anywhere. There's another Booth doing interesting work nearby, Charles Booth, no relation, who's been documenting poverty with a kind of obsessive data collection that feels very Victorian. He's making these poverty maps, literally colour-coding sections of London based on the income levels of residents. Yellow for the comfortable, red and black for the poor and very poor, and the maps are disturbing in their detail, because they show that poverty isn't scattered randomly but concentrated, clustered, systemic. His work is impressive and also horrifying, because it proves that this isn't some natural phenomenon, it's a structured pattern, a geographic lock-in that makes it nearly impossible to escape once you're in a red area. But charity itself is complicated in a way that respectable society doesn't seem interested in acknowledging. There's this distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor that gets enforced with absolute rigidity. The deserving poor are people who've fallen into poverty through circumstances beyond their control: widows, accident victims, the chronically ill. The undeserving poor are you, people who are poor presumably because you haven't worked hard enough or made better choices or been virtuous enough. The distinction is morally grotesque and practically devastating because it means that the poorest people, who might actually be poor because of mental illness or addiction, or the simple bad luck of being born into a working-class family in a city that requires capital to survive, get the least help. There are ragged schools scattered around the city, schools for poor children that are trying to do basic education with almost no resources. Lord Shaftesbury is involved with them, a wealthy man who actually seems to have some genuine compassion, though compassion from wealth is a complicated thing because it often comes with the implicit belief that poor people are deficient and need to be improved. You end up at a Salvation Army meeting one evening, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly because they announce free tea and biscuits, and you are cold and empty and not in a position to turn down either. The meeting room is packed, maybe 100 people, and you're struck immediately by the fact that everyone is dirty, everyone is worn out, everyone looks like they've been through the kind of exhaustion that comes from simply surviving, which makes the Salvation Army soldiers standing in their uniforms at the front of the room look like they've never had an actual struggle in their lives, which is probably partly true and partly not true, because who knows what happens behind closed doors. But then the brass band starts playing, and something shifts. The music is loud and enthusiastic and completely wrong for the room, and yet somehow absolutely right. It's not sad, which would be condescending. It's not overly happy, which would be insulting. It's just music presented with the kind of confidence that this music matters, that this group of people matter enough to play instruments for. People start clapping, someone starts singing, and for a moment, a brief, fragile moment, the room feels like a place where something other than survival is happening. You drink the tea, which is terrible, hot water with a vague memory of tea, and eat the biscuits, which are hard enough that you suspect they were baked sometime last week. But you're warm and inside and surrounded by people, and there's music, and that's something. And Salvation Army soldier, a woman with kind eyes and the kind of relentless optimism that would be annoying if it didn't seem so genuine, sits next to you and tells you that salvation is possible, that God doesn't judge you the way society judges you, that there's a place for you even if every institution has told you otherwise. It's probably not true, but it's also possible that it is true, and the possibility is enough to make you sit there a bit longer than you probably should, letting the warmth and the brass band and the soft voice of this woman convince you that maybe, in some universe you don't currently inhabit, you might have value beyond your economic productivity. You've also heard about Annie Besant, though you don't know her work directly. Someone at the pub mentioned her, she's a reformer apparently, involved in various causes related to improving conditions for working people. The fact that her name came up in conversation suggests that people are aware that there are actually human beings trying to change the system, which is somehow more and less hopeful than you'd like it to be. More hopeful because change is theoretically possible. Less hopeful because change is apparently so rare that when someone's actually trying to create it, it's remarkable enough to mention casually. Charity, you're starting to understand, is a substitute for justice. It's what a society offers when it doesn't want to fundamentally restructure the systems that create poverty. It's the equivalent of giving a person a crutch instead of healing their broken leg, useful in the immediate moment, but ultimately not addressing the actual problem. The Salvation Army is doing something, is genuinely offering comfort to people who have nothing, but they're offering comfort within a system that was designed to create this suffering, and that's a fundamental contradiction that nothing can quite resolve. Still, you find yourself going back to the Salvation Army meetings. The warmth helps, and the tea and biscuits help, and the music helps, and maybe that's all you can realistically expect from any institution designed by and for people who haven't experienced what you're experiencing. The lamplighters are one of those urban professions that you only notice once you start paying attention to them, which means you probably never would have noticed them at all if you weren't now out on the streets at the exact hours when their work becomes necessary. They arrive as the light starts to die, moving along the streets with their distinctive ladders and their long poles with the lit taper at the end, igniting gas lamps one by one, turning the city into a patchwork of illuminated and dark spaces. There are roughly 60,000 gas lamps in London, according to someone you overheard at the pub, and they employ a surprisingly large number of lamplighters, men whose entire job is to move through the city ensuring that these lamps are lit, functional, and not leaking gas into the atmosphere. It's actually kind of beautiful work in its way. This systematic progression of light spreading across the city as darkness arrives, as if the lamplighters are performing some kind of nightly ceremony that keeps the city conscious and alive. Before gas lamps there was just darkness. Before that there was candles and fire, and a city that had to go to sleep at night because there was no viable way to see. What the gas lamps did was extend human hours, stretch the workday into darkness, make nighttime into something that could be economically productive, which was apparently worth the trade-off of turning the entire city into something quieter, colder, more separate and isolated, because gas lamps don't create connection the way fire did. Fire required proximity, required people gathered around heat and light. Gas lamps create isolated pools of visibility, bubbles of light separated from other bubbles by darkness. The psychology of that darkness is weird and specific. Each lamp creates roughly 12 candles worth of light, which sounds like a lot until you consider that 12 candles is barely enough to read by, barely enough to really see someone's face clearly. The pools of light become almost claustrophobic. You're standing in your little bubble of visibility, but the darkness beyond the lamp is absolutely absolute. If someone steps out of the darkness and into your pool of light, you can see them clearly. If they stay in the darkness, you have no idea what they're doing, where they are, what they're planning. People's behaviour changes in these pools of light. There's something about standing in a visible space surrounded by darkness that makes you more aware of your body, your position, your visibility to others. You find yourself walking differently at night, more carefully, more aware of exactly who's in your pool of light with you. You've started to understand the gangs and the criminals and the workers differently. The light is power, in a weird way, or at least power is distributed differently based on who controls the light. The gas leaks are a constant low-level danger that nobody really talks about. Gas pipes run through the streets, and the pipes leak, and the gas is heavier than air, so it settles in basements and low spaces. You've heard stories about families waking up sick from gas accumulation, about a house burning down from a gas leak ignited by an open flame. Carbon monoxide poisoning is a quiet death, an invisible killer that technically isn't killing you because it's not violent. It's just slowly making you unable to process oxygen. And isn't that a very Victorian way to die, efficiently, without causing too much fuss? Walking home lamp to lamp has become your nightly ritual. You've learned the streets well enough now that you can predict where the lamps are, where the dark stretches are going to be, which paths are well lit and which ones require real bravery to navigate. You've also learned to move through the lamplit spaces differently than you move through the dark spaces. In the light, you're visible, which means you need to look respectable, or at least not threatening. In the darkness, you can be anyone. You can move like you're running from something or chasing something, and nobody in the light will see you clearly enough to remember later. The lamplighters themselves are interesting. They're doing necessary work that keeps the city functioning, yet they're mostly invisible, mostly noticed only in the moment when the light suddenly appears, when darkness is pushed back temporarily. You've watched them work, watched them manage their elaborate equipment, watched them move through the streets with the kind of systematic determination that speaks to something resembling a job, something resembling purpose and regular work and money at the end of it. The juxtaposition is strange. As the lamps go out at night and the gaslit streets take on this weird, cold quality, the city becomes paradoxically more dangerous and more populated. The darkness brings out people who wouldn't walk these streets in daylight, criminals certainly, but also workers on night shifts, street singers, the unfortunately employed women working particular establishments. The night streets have a whole different economy, a whole different social structure than the daylit streets. You've started to prefer the darkness, actually, or at least you've started to prefer it to daylight, which seems counterintuitive but makes sense when you consider that in daylight, you're more visible as someone clearly without a home, clearly without resources, clearly belonging to the underclass. In darkness, everyone's a bit less visible, everyone's a bit more equal, everyone's moving through light and shadow without too much scrutiny. The gas lamps, you realise, are about control. They're about the city asserting that it owns the night, that darkness will not be allowed to exist without human-imposed light, that the city's infrastructure and order extends into the hours when nature would prefer chaos. It's impressive, and it's depressing, and it's exactly the kind of Victorian solution to a Victorian problem. Instead of accepting the natural rhythm of darkness and sleep, they've installed 60,000 mechanical substitutes for the sun. The music hall on Commercial Street is where you've ended up on several evenings when you had a few pence to spare and the impulse to be somewhere other than a lodging house or the streets. The penny gallery at the very top is where people like you sit, packed together on wooden benches, looking down at a stage that's maybe 15 feet away, and the whole enterprise is an exercise in controlled chaos and democratic entertainment. The format is variety, act after act after act, everything from comedians to singers to acrobats to dancers to whatever else might keep an audience's attention for 3 hours. The comedians are doing observational humour about the East End life, jokes that hit because they are about the actual reality of being poor and working class in London. The comedians are heckling the audience, and the audience is heckling them back, and there's this weird mutual respect happening between performer and audience, because everyone knows that the humour only works if it's genuinely about their shared reality. You're struck one evening by a comedian who's doing material about the workhouse, about the oakum picking and the gruel and the uniforms, and he's getting huge laughs, but they're the kind of laughs that contain genuine trauma. People are laughing so hard they're almost crying because this man has articulated something that's been sitting in their chests, unspoken, for months or years. It's the kind of performance that feels almost therapeutic, except that catharsis is a luxury that poor people can only afford for a penny. The audience participation is expected and robust. If you don't like an act, you're permitted, almost required, to let them know. You see a singer get literally booed off the stage, not because he was terrible, but because he was boring, and the audience has standards. You see a comedian get standing ovation that goes on for so long, he has to come back out and do an encore. The power dynamic is weird because the audience technically has all the power, they're paying for this. But the performers have the confidence that comes with being the ones on stage. There are penny gaffs scattered around the neighbourhood, unlicensed theatres operating out of basements and converted shop spaces, showing plays or musical performances to people who can't quite afford the real music halls but who still need entertainment. They're technically illegal, operating without proper permits or licenses, but they persist because demand is consistent and enforcement is inconsistent. You've been to one exactly once, and it was a strange experience of cultural production on the absolute lowest budget, but there was still something happening, still something that felt like theatre and meaning and shared experience. The heart of the evening, though, the moment that makes the whole penny worth spending, comes when a particular beautiful singer takes the stage. You don't know her name, you've never seen her before. She just walks out wearing a dress that's probably not new but is wearing it with the kind of dignity that makes it look like it was expensive, and she opens her mouth, and the entire room stops breathing. She's singing a ballad, the kind of song that would be dismissed as sentimental if she wasn't performing it with such complete emotional honesty. It's about a young man gone to war, presumed dead, and a woman waiting for him to come home, waiting with diminishing hope, waiting with the kind of slowly building despair that transforms hope into just persistence. There's not a single person in the Penny Gallery who hasn't experienced that kind of waiting, that kind of hope turning into habit, and the silence in the room is absolute. You can hear her clearly despite the terrible acoustics and the lack of any amplification beyond her own voice. You can feel the emotion in every note like it's physically coming toward you. You can feel the room around you stop existing, feel your own life stop existing, feel nothing but this song and this woman, and the specific kind of beautiful sadness that she's managed to create. When she finishes, she holds the last note just long enough for you to feel it change from sound into something almost physical, and then the room explodes. People are on their feet, throwing coins onto the stage, throwing coins they obviously needed for something more practical. You find yourself with your hands together, clapping so hard they hurt, tears on your face that you weren't aware were developing. That's the thing about entertainment for people with nothing. It's not a luxury, it's not frivolous. It's a mechanism of survival. It's the way you remind yourself that beauty exists, that emotion is real, that there's something beyond basic animal survival happening in this city. The woman on the stage probably makes barely enough to eat, probably has her own poverty and her own struggles, but for those few minutes she's transformed the entire Penny Gallery into something transcendent. This is what the respectable classes never quite understand. Poor people aren't destroying themselves through entertainment the way the moralists claim. Poor people are using entertainment to stay alive. The music halls, the penny gaffs, the street singers, the comedians. They're not vices, they're lifelines. They're the mechanism by which the human spirit refuses to die in the face of systematic indifference. You walk out of the music hall that evening with the song still in your head, still feeling the echo of that voice. And the streets are somehow slightly less hostile than they were when you walked in. The gas lamps seem a bit brighter. The darkness seems a bit less absolute. And you've been reminded that survival isn't just about not dying. It's also about being reminded that you're alive, that your emotions matter, that there's something in you that's not just machinery designed to earn money and pay rent. That's worth a penny. That's worth more than a penny. That's the kind of moment that makes it possible to exist in this city, in this poverty, without simply choosing to end the whole thing and be done with it. You've walked past the mortuary on Whitechapel Road enough times now that you barely register the smell, that particular mixture of lime powder, carbolic, and something underneath that your nose has learned not to investigate. The building's red brick is grimy with soot, and someone scratched their initials into the doorframe, which is the kind of thing that makes you wonder about their mental state. But you understand it, in a way. You understand needing to mark yourself somewhere before the city erases you entirely. It's a small rebellion against the mathematics of anonymity, and in 1888 London, small rebellions are the only kind most people have access to. The numbers, though. The numbers are what stick with you. You've overheard the doctors talking. 1 in 7 deaths in this neighbourhood is tuberculosis. 1 in 7. It's like a lottery, except the prize is a slow cough that becomes your entire world, and then it becomes nothing. The infant mortality rate hovers around 150 to 200 for every 1,000 live births, which means if you see a mother with 4 children, statistically speaking, she's already buried 1, maybe 2. Sometimes you do the math automatically now without meaning to, watching a woman walk past with her surviving children and calculating the ghost that should be walking beside her. It's become a habit, and not a good one. It's the habit of someone who's learned to see death as part of the infrastructure, the way you see streets and buildings. Typhoid, typhus, smallpox, diphtheria. They rattle off these names like they're brands of soap at the market, and maybe in some corner of your mind that's what they've become, just another stain you can't quite get clean. The doctors have charts and theories about miasmas and bad air and constitutional weakness, and they dispense their diagnoses with the kind of confidence that makes you understand why anyone would believe them, even when they're almost certainly wrong. A person's life expectancy is about 30 years if they're born in the poorest streets. 30 years if they're extraordinarily lucky, if they don't get the wrong disease in the wrong year, if your parents had enough money to feed you properly as a child. Wealthy neighbourhoods get 50, sometimes more, sometimes substantially more, And you've heard rumours of women in Mayfair who live into their 70s as though that were a normal human thing to do. Historians still argue whether Victorian London's class system was fundamentally callous, or simply built on the kind of willful ignorance that everyone practiced so well they forgot they were practicing it, a forgetting so complete it became its own moral framework. The burial clubs fascinate you in a grim way that you don't enjoy but can't quite stop. Everyone pays their pennies, their halfpennies, sometimes their farthings, because the one thing that absolutely cannot happen is the pauper's grave. That mass, unmarked pit at the edge of everything, where the bodies go when there's no one to pay and no club to cover it. You've heard stories about what those pits are like. Bodies stacked, sometimes not fully settled, the earth covering them in the casual way the earth covers everything. You've heard that even people who die of starvation manage to scrape together their burial money because that is the final insult. The thing that means you didn't matter enough to take up a foot of earth with your name on it. That you'll be forgotten not metaphorically but literally, your grave unmarked and therefore non-existent. So everyone pays, everyone saves. It's like an insurance policy on dignity, except dignity in 1888 costs approximately twopence a week, which is approximately 10% of what an unskilled labourer makes. The mourning rituals are theatrical in a way that makes you think Victorians got something right about grief. They weren't ashamed to make it visible. The blacks, the armbands, the elaborate wreaths, and the specific periods of mourning that are calibrated by relationship. It's excessive, sure, but at least it's honest. At least when your mother dies, the whole neighbourhood knows you're allowed to be devastated for a socially prescribed period, and that's preferable to the modern way of pretending that death isn't happening while it's happening. You get your catastrophe acknowledged. You get to wear your sorrow where everyone can see it. You get permission for a few months to be less productive, less cheerful, less available for other people's needs. The mortuary's front window is dark today, but you know what's inside. You know there's a man with pneumonia and lungs that don't expand properly anymore, not from any exotic origin, but from the ordinary cruelty of ordinary industrial work and ordinary damp and ordinary bad luck. You know there's an infant whose mother was too exhausted from piecework to notice the fever until it was too late, until fever became stillness, and stillness became something that needs a burial club to cover. You know that by tomorrow a funeral will happen, modest or grand, depending entirely on the accident of birth, on whether your parents had enough foresight to save her pennies, on whether anyone loves you enough to spend money you don't have on flowers, and then the earth will receive another Londoner, and the city will shuffle forward as if nothing happened, because it didn't happen to anyone who matters to the people who make the news. It occurs to you that you're still relatively young and don't cough more than average. You have that going for you. It's not nothing. In this lottery, not having bought a ticket yet is its own kind of luck, though luck isn't the right word because luck implies randomness, and this isn't random. It's determined, it's designed, it's the inevitable result of the way the city is organised. But you'll take whatever you can call it. The lottery isn't over yet. You've still got time to breathe. One peculiar thing you've learned: some doctors believe that cold air is actually protective, that keeping windows sealed shut and allowing miasmatic vapours to accumulate indoors is somehow less dangerous than exposure to the open air, that the body needs to be kept warm and still to fight disease. They're completely wrong, of course, but they're very sincere about it, and sincerity has a way of being more convincing than accuracy. Science and stubbornness are close cousins, and you're learning that they often wear the same face. You keep walking. The mortuary recedes behind you, and you're thinking about how you'll go another week, and then another week, and then one day, maybe far away, maybe soon, you'll be inside that building and someone else will walk past it without thinking very hard about you at all. It's a thought that should be depressing, but right now it's almost comforting. The knowledge that everybody goes the same direction eventually, that no amount of success or failure changes the end point. It's the one democracy that death offers, and it's the only one that's absolutely guaranteed. The woman at the market has 4 children hanging off her like fruit on a tree, and she's negotiating the price of 2 pounds of turnips with a vendor who knows exactly how desperate she is, and is enjoying that knowledge immensely. You stop a few paces away pretending to examine cabbages, but really you're watching the negotiation like it's a theatrical performance, because it kind of is. It's the same performance that gets repeated thousands of times every day in London, the dance of need and exploitation, and the tiny margin between survival and starvation. The oldest girl can't be more than 8. She's holding a baby that's definitely not hers, just borrowed from a younger sibling or perhaps an even younger responsibility, and the baby's got a fist in its mouth and the particular vacant stare of an infant who's learned not to cry because crying doesn't result in food, just more crying, and noise doesn't help anybody. This is what you see when you walk through Whitechapel. Women. Everywhere. Women. More women than men, seemingly, though that's probably just because the work that women do is more visible, more spread out across the streets. Domestic service is the single largest employer of women in London. Over 1 million of them scattered across households throughout the city, starting at 4 in the morning to stoke the fires and end their day at midnight if their employers are particularly demanding about the state of the drawing rooms. They earn roughly between £15 and £20 annually if they're lucky and not beautiful enough to have other complications, and they're expected to be grateful for this because it includes room and board, which sounds generous until you realise the room is probably a cupboard under the stairs, and the board is probably yesterday's leftovers. The needle trades employ hundreds of thousands more, hunched over piecework in sweated workshops that are barely lit and definitely not ventilated, earning so little that a single illness means immediate destitution, that missing a day of work means missing rent, that being sick is a luxury only the wealthy can afford. Women make approximately 10 shillings a week in these workshops if they're diligent and fast, and diligence and speed are the only commodities they have to trade. The mathematics of women's labour are deliberately broken, designed that way, constructed to ensure that independence is impossible, and dependence is the only available option. And then there's prostitution. This is the thing nobody says aloud, but everyone knows, and you know it too. For some women, it's not a moral failing, it's mathematics, it's survival. It's what happens when your wage as a shop assistant barely covers rent, and the shop assistant's wages are the respectable option, the one that comes with permission and social acknowledgement. It's what happens when a governess's salary is less than what a man's pocket change might amount to. Historians still argue whether Victorian morality was genuinely shocked by sex work, or whether the shock was simply the required posture. A useful fiction that allowed society to condemn the seller while enthusiastically hiring the goods, to criminalise the woman while patronising the woman, to create a system where the only way to survive is to violate the very moral code that your survival will confirm you to be immoral under. The double standard sits heavy in the air like fog. A man can gamble away his wages and be a scoundrel, a cautionary tale but not a condemned one. A woman can sell her body and becomes contaminated, legally, morally, spiritually, in ways that no amount of washing will fix. A man's past can be forgotten or rebranded. A woman's past follows her like a shadow, growing longer the further the sun of respectability moves away from her. She'll never be wholly clean again in this society's eyes. She'll be what she did once forever. But something is shifting, and you can feel it in certain conversations and certain pamphlets that appear on certain corners in whispered discussions about things that women aren't supposed to think about. The Married Women's Property Act came through just 6 years ago, in 1882, which means married women can now own property and keep their own wages instead of having everything belong to their husbands automatically. It's shocking how recent that is. It's shocking how much that isn't, how much that still leaves untouched and unfixed. The suffrage idea is still fringy, mostly whispered by women who've read things they probably shouldn't read, who have political thoughts in an era when political thoughts are something women aren't supposed to possess in the same way they're not supposed to possess ambitions or anger, or the belief that their lives could be different. But you've heard the word vote more times in the past month than in your entire previous life, and you're starting to understand that it means something. It means that some women have stopped accepting that this is how it has to be. The woman at the market wins her negotiation, barely, and gets the turnips for twopence halfpenny instead of threepence. She's not happy about it, but she's not surprised, which might be worse. The defeat is so expected that it barely registers as defeat. She gathers her children the way you gather scattered coins and moves along. The oldest girl looks up at you as they pass, and there's something in that glance. A moment of mutual recognition, perhaps, of lives constrained by economic forces utterly beyond both your comprehension, of being held in place by systems you didn't build and can't escape. The baby's asleep now. Everything in London sleeps when it's this exhausted, when staying awake costs more energy than your body has to give. One interesting quirk you've noticed. Some women in the needle trades have started pooling their resources to rent tiny rooms together, creating unofficial cooperatives where the rent is split and the work is shared, and maybe, just maybe, there's enough money to eat something other than bread. It's not revolutionary, but it's not nothing either. It's mathematics becoming community, Transformation happening in slow motion. You buy some potatoes from another vendor and walk home thinking about all the women who aren't on the street, who are invisible in different ways. The governesses in households, the kitchen maids, the charlatans scrubbing other people's floors starting before sunrise, the women doing invisible work in invisible rooms, millions of them, each one doing exactly what she's supposed to do and getting precisely nothing for it, except the knowledge that tomorrow is identical to today, and next week will be identical to this week, and next year will be identical to this year, unless something breaks, unless something shifts, unless someone decides that it doesn't have to be this way anymore. The docks smell like everything London is, salt and tar and human sweat and spilled cargo, and the particular reek of whale oil, and beneath it all, something like possibility, which is maybe just the smell of money changing hands. You've walked down here enough times now to notice the rhythm, the way the cranes move like tired giants, the shouts of the foreman, the organised chaos of a system that somehow works, despite being designed by people who generally don't care whether it works, or just whether it makes money. The coordination is almost admirable, if you can admire something that exists solely to exploit the people doing the coordinating. 40,000 ships per year come through London. 40,000! This is the busiest port in the entire world, and nothing even comes close. On a given day, you're standing in the presence of people from every corner of the globe, Lascars from India, Scandinavians from Norway and Sweden, Chinese workers in Limehouse, West Indians, Africans, Portuguese, all of them here because London wants everything and is willing to pay just barely enough for these men to bring it in. The word Lascar itself has started to become shorthand for disposable, which is probably unfair but also probably true. These men are paid less, housed in worse conditions given the most dangerous work, and blamed when anything goes wrong. There's a whole hierarchical system of exploitation, with English workers at the top complaining about the foreigners taking their wages, never quite noticing that the real thief is the man doing the hiring, not the man doing the work. The stevedores and lightermen and coal whippers, these are the men who actually do the work, the ones whose muscles turn cargo into commerce, whose hands and backs are the real engine of London's prosperity. They're organised in ways that are becoming increasingly visible and increasingly angry. Ben Tillett has been organising quietly and then less quietly. You've heard his name whispered in pubs, seen his face on papers, heard him speak about the possibility of a strike. The talk is of a strike coming, next year, maybe this year if things worsen, when the dockers will simply not work and see if London's prosperity can survive without them for more than 48 hours. The whisper is that it can't. The whisper is that the system depends entirely on their compliance, and what happens when they withdraw it, even temporarily, nobody really knows. Historians still argue whether the 1889 dock strike that's being planned is a moment of worker consciousness awakening and recognising its own power, or simply an expression of economic desperation so acute that even the risk of starvation seems acceptable compared to the certainty of slow degradation, whether it's revolution or just drowning men thrashing because they're drowning. You sit on a bollard with a penny loaf and some cheese, watching the river move like dark muscle beneath the surface. A lighter, one of the flat-bottomed boats, passes close enough that you can see the waterman's face weathered to the colour of old leather. He doesn't look at you. Why would he? You're just another person sitting on a dock eating bread. There are thousands of you every day, all invisible to each other and to the men who own everything. The thing about the docks is that they're honest in a way the rest of London pretends not to be. Nobody here is maintaining that the system is fair. Nobody is suggesting that the available work will feed your family or shelter them adequately, that it will do anything except extend their survival for another week. The contract is simple and visible. You trade your body's capacity for work against the minimum amount of money required to keep that body from dying, and if your body fails, if your back gives out, if you develop a cough, if your hands become too stiff, if you get caught in machinery, there's a line of 100 other bodies waiting for your spot. It's brutal, it's clear. There's almost something respectful about that clarity. A ship from Scandinavia is being unloaded, timber mostly and grain, and something in barrels that smells of tar and desperation. The Norwegian crew moves with a kind of easy competence that makes you think of cold places with fewer people, though you know that's probably just romanticism. Everywhere has the same systems, everywhere has people who own things and people who don't, and people in the middle who spend their days negotiating the distance. One odd detail you've picked up. The superstitions are elaborate and specific. Whistling on a ship is bad luck because it might summon wind that nobody wants. Mentioning pigs is bad luck because it's considered a bad omen, a curse. The sailors have a whole language of avoidances, and they follow these rules with the same intensity they bring to their work, as if the universe is a thing that can be negotiated with through the proper ritual, as if staying alive is partly about doing things right and partly about doing them correctly, and partly about not looking directly at the forces trying to kill you. You finish your bread and watch the cranes move. Somewhere in these dockyards is someone making actual choices about the future. Someone with capital and plans and the ability to imagine themselves 5 years from now with more capital and better plans. But where you're sitting, on a bollard with the Thames smell in your clothes, the future is just tomorrow, and tomorrow looks a lot like today. The crane swings, the cargo moves, the lightermen work, the river flows toward the sea the way rivers do, indifferent to the human activity happening on its banks. You could stay here all day. You would if staying meant food and shelter, but it doesn't. The work you've got is somewhere else, and time is the one resource that really does move toward depletion, that slips away whether you're paying attention or not. Sunday in London is a peculiar kind of quiet, not peaceful exactly, but enforced, which is different and arguably worse. The pubs don't open until 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which seems designed specifically to keep people miserable during the morning hours when they most need distraction, when the weight of unstructured time and the knowledge of their own existence becomes impossible to ignore. Most entertainment venues are closed, theatres are shuttered, dancing is morally suspect. The whole city becomes an experiment in whether humans can be kept sufficiently bored that they'll just naturally become more virtuous, and the answer appears to be decisively no. They just become irritable and sleep longer, and develop a kind of gnawing anxiety that doesn't dissipate. You wake at 7 o'clock anyway, despite the lack of reason to. Your body has learned the rhythm, and it doesn't care whether it's a work day or the Lord's day. The body is stubborn about its habits, resistant to change, keeps to its schedule even when the schedule is meaningless. The ceiling of your room has a water stain in the shape of something that could be Ireland, or could be a man's face, depending on your mood and the angle of the light. You've been studying it for weeks. It's not expanding, which is either good news or just very slow bad news, like most things in London. Church attendance is lower than the establishment would like, which everyone acknowledges with a kind of embarrassed shuffle. The churches are big and draughty and smell like furniture wax and the accumulated guilt of centuries, and the sermons are long and contain very little that would be useful to a person trying to figure out how to eat or stay warm. So people go sometimes, out of habit or fear of divine punishment or the strange human impulse to dress well and sit together in uncomfortable silence occasionally, to feel like they're part of something larger than themselves, even if that something is just tradition. But not everyone. Not most people. Most people are sleeping or sitting or trying not to think about Monday. The cemetery is different. Cemetery walks are popular, genuinely popular, and you understand why when you finally go. There's something about being surrounded by death that's oddly comforting. All these people, settled and no longer struggling, their names carved into stone so that at least the universe will acknowledge they were here. It's warmer than church, metaphorically speaking. Actually speaking, it's colder. Definitely colder, but metaphorically it's exactly right. There's honesty in a graveyard. There's no pretending that everything will be fine. The children who would normally be working are freed for the day, and they've already figured out that Sunday is their time. You watch them play in the streets, a game involving a ball made of rags and twine, played across the cobblestones with an intensity that suggests they're aware their playtime is severely rationed, that Monday will come and it will all stop again. Historians still argue whether Victorian childhood, at least for working-class children, was traumatic, or whether children are simply remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of finding joy in the most arbitrary of circumstances, whether their resilience is inspiring, or just proof that humans can get used to anything if they're started young enough. By noon, you're hungry, which seems unfair, but Saturday's wages are already spent and Sunday work doesn't exist. You read part of a newspaper someone left on a bench, a story about a society woman's charitable work in the East End, written as though poverty is something to be visited like a museum exhibit, something with proper visiting hours and perhaps a small fee. A recipe for something elaborate that would cost more than your weekly rent. An advertisement for a tonic that promises to cure absolutely everything, including a disease called female nervousness, which you strongly suspect is code for wanting things a man's society won't let you have, for being ambitious or angry or unwilling to smile. The pub opens at 1, and you spend 4p on a pint and a bit of sausage, and you sit in a corner watching people try to drink away the peculiar anxiety of unstructured time. By evening, the energy has shifted again. The city is resetting itself for Monday. The factories are tomorrow. The streets are tomorrow. Tonight is just the held breath before the mechanism starts again, the pause before the exhale. You lie back in your room watching the island or face stain on the ceiling and listening to the sounds of a city that's almost asleep. Distant carts, someone singing badly, the fog muffling everything into softness. Your body's tired, not from work since there wasn't any today, but from the particular exhaustion of having nowhere to go and no reason to get there, from the weight of time passing while you're stationary. The mind gets tired in different ways than the body does. One strange thing you've learned: some people believe that Sunday rest actually weakens the body if it's not accustomed to idleness, and that the poor should work every day as a matter of physical fitness, that idleness creates moral corruption and physical degeneration simultaneously. This belief exists alongside the belief that they shouldn't work Sundays for moral reasons. Both beliefs are held by educated people simultaneously. The contradiction is so complete that it approaches honesty, as though the inability to think clearly is at least better than some kinds of clarity. You'll sleep well tonight, you think. You'll sleep the way you only can when the entire city has been forced to stop with you, when the mechanism has paused and everyone is just waiting. For a few hours, the inequality is suspended and you're all just people lying in the dark waiting for tomorrow to come. For a few hours, even sleep is democratic. You start your walk at Whitechapel and deliberately head west, which is something you've been thinking about doing for a while, but kept avoiding. The way you avoid looking directly at the sun because you know it will hurt your eyes. Walking west in London is like watching a landscape transform inch by inch, wealth accumulating in the buildings the way sediment accumulates in a river. Regent Street is only a few miles away, but it might as well be another city entirely, another country entirely, another century entirely. The first gradient is almost imperceptible. The streets get marginally cleaner, the shop windows are less broken, there are slightly fewer people sleeping in doorways, and slightly more people who are clearly sleeping indoors in rooms with actual beds. Then it becomes obvious: Bond Street, Piccadilly, Mayfair. The buildings here are made for people who have already won and intend to stay winning. They're made to announce that winning was possible, is possible, has been achieved by these particular people who are currently inside them, drinking something warm and knowing that their heating bills are paid through next year and into the year after that. The horses here are glossier, better fed, more carefully groomed. The paint on the doors is fresher, the knockers are shinier, the windows are cleaner. The women's dresses cost more than your annual rent, possibly more than your entire life's accumulated wages. Regent Street is something else entirely. It's a vision of what London has decided the future should look like. Wide, orderly, designed with intention. The storefronts are theatrical, almost aggressive in their beauty. Gaslighting is more generous with its illumination, more frequently placed, more reliable. There are policemen who don't seem to be investigating poverty but simply maintaining a pleasant atmosphere, who are protecting things rather than controlling people. You could get lost in the sheer assumption of all of it, the assumption that streets should be arranged for beauty, that people should have surplus money for unnecessary things, for silk and ribbons and books and things that exist only to be beautiful. Your presence on a street is something you have a right to without someone questioning it, without someone wondering if you should be there. The income inequality is so complete that it's almost abstract. The top 1% of London own something like 70% of the wealth, which means that the systems you're walking through here, these buildings, these streets, these opportunities, this entire possibility space, they belong almost entirely to a group of people you've never met and never will, because they don't move through the spaces you move through. They have entirely different London. Different air, probably, definitely different fog. They've organised their world so completely that they can almost forget that the other London exists, the one you live in, the one with the mortality rates and the sweated workshops and the paupers' graves. What's interesting is how selective the blindness is. Wealthy people can live in the same city as the workhouses and somehow experience them as completely separate phenomena. The way you might experience a disease in someone else's body is relevant but not urgent. The RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was founded back in 1824 and is now quite well organised, and morally passionate about the treatment of horses. Horses. There are human beings in Whitechapel living in conditions that no horse would tolerate, that would scandalise the RSPCA if they were documented with the same care that animal suffering is documented, and the organised compassion of this city is directed toward equines. This fact sits with you like a stone, a weight that you carry and that doesn't diminish with time. Historians still argue whether this disparity represents genuine Victorian confusion about what deserves moral consideration, whether the capacity for moral feeling somehow stops at species boundaries, or whether it's a calculated system of distraction. Give the middle classes something to feel virtuous about, give them a cause they can champion, and they won't notice the actual atrocity happening a few miles east. Keep them focused on animal welfare and they won't see human welfare. It's brilliant, really, in a terrible way. You walk a bit further, taking in the visual evidence of what's possible, the architectural suggestion that human beings can live this way, without fear, without hunger, without calculation, without the constant mathematics of survival. Everything here speaks of surplus, of excess, of the possibility of having enough, and then having more than enough. Then you turn around and walk back deliberately, marking the moment of turning, feeling the weight of what you're leaving behind. The contrast is physical. Your chest tightens. The streets east of Piccadilly darken incrementally, the same way they brightened, and by the time you're back in Whitechapel, you've crossed an invisible border that might as well be a wall. The buildings are smaller again, more crowded, pressed together. The people are denser, moving in tighter patterns. The shops are selling damaged goods and second-hand clothes, things that have already been used and found wanting and are being recycled downward. The energy is different, tighter, more desperate, more real, or perhaps just more honest about its desperation. You eat a kipper from a street vendor and try to stop thinking about what you've just seen, but you can't quite manage it. It's there now, the knowledge of this other London, this adjacent possibility. You know exactly what's a few miles away. You know what exists in the same moment as this moment, separated only by distance and birth, and the accumulated decisions of people much richer than you. Somewhere right now, while you're eating a kipper, someone is eating roasted pheasant. While you're calculating whether you can afford another loaf, someone is calculating which wine pairs best with dinner. The stone in your chest doesn't move. You'll carry it for the rest of the night. You'll probably carry it longer than that, through tomorrow and next week, and as long as you stay in this city, as long as you stay aware of what you're not allowed to have. The rain is falling in that particular London way, not violently but consistently, with the kind of patience that suggests it might continue forever, that the weather system has decided that London needs a solid month of this, and is committed to the project. There's an open-air meeting happening in the rain anyway, and you stop because you're cold anyway, and the warmth of the crowd is worth the discomfort of the wetness. A man in a damp jacket is talking about the match girls' strike that happened in July, nearly a year ago now, when the girls at Bryant and May walked out, rather than continue being poisoned by phosphorus at tuppence halfpenny a week, breathing in the yellow dust that eventually destroys your teeth and your health and your ability to have children. Annie Besant organised it. She's a woman with ideas and no apparent fear, which is rare enough to be worth paying attention to, rare enough that people remember her name and mention it in rain-soaked meetings a year later. The man is talking about how the strike lasted 2 weeks and how the girls won. They got their wages raised, they got some safety improvements, they proved that walking out was possible, and this is the thing that these meetings keep circling back to. What happened in July suggests that what happens tomorrow doesn't have to look like what happened yesterday. The idea that poverty isn't inevitable, the idea that systems can be changed by people who have nothing to lose but the very little they have, and maybe that's actually enough leverage. The idea that when enough people stop cooperating with their own exploitation, something has to give. William Morris is mentioned, the socialist, the artist, the man who believes that beauty and equity are somehow connected, which is either profound or ridiculous, and the rain-dampened crowd seems to believe it's profound. The Fabian Society is mentioned, and people nod as though they know what that means. The Social Democratic Federation is mentioned. These are organisations that believe in something called the future, and they're trying to build it from the accumulated anger of people like you, people who understand that the way things are now is not the way they have to be, that systems are made of decisions and decisions can be unmade. A woman in the crowd catches your eye and nods slightly, and you nod back, and that's all the revolution you managed tonight. Mutual recognition between two people who are both cold and both suspicious that the world might be made of something other than inevitability. It's not much, but it's something. In a city designed to make you feel isolated, to make you believe that your suffering is individual rather than systemic, that nod means something. Historians still argue whether bottom-up activism represents genuine social change, or whether the real transformation has to come from the top down, from people with actual resources and power willing to redistribute them. But the thing about these meetings is that they don't seem to be waiting for permission from above. They're just talking, just meeting in the rain, just suggesting that another version of London is possible. They're not asking, they're declaring. The speaker is getting more heated now, animated by the knowledge that at least this crowd is listening, that his words aren't falling into a void. He's talking about how the dock strike that's planned for next year could be the thing that breaks everything open, that forces the system to acknowledge the people who actually make it work. 1 year away, not far, maybe possible. The energy in the crowd is shifting, becoming less passive, becoming something that feels almost like hope, or at least like possibility. You leave before the meeting ends because your wet clothes are starting to stick in ways that suggest illness might be moving in, and you've already heard enough to think about for one night, enough to change the way you see things incrementally. The rain is heavier now, or maybe you're just more aware of it, more sensitive to its weight. You walk through Whitechapel streets that are becoming familiar in ways you didn't expect. The shop at the corner where the proprietor sometimes gives you broken biscuits, the cat that sleeps in the alley and occasionally allows you to touch it, the specific slope of the cobblestones near the 10 Bells where water collects on rainy days. The peculiar thing about these activist meetings is that you always leave them feeling two ways simultaneously. Inspired that change might be possible, that the system isn't as solid as it seems, and exhausted by the knowledge that it will require so much effort, so much risk, from people who are already spending all their energy just surviving. The hope and the weariness exist in the same space. You're learning to live with both, to hold them simultaneously without either one cancelling the other out. One odd detail from the meeting, someone mentioned that W.T. Stead's Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon article in 1885 changed how people talked about sexual exploitation by actually showing rather than suggesting what was happening, by forcing people to confront the reality rather than allowing them to maintain comfortable ignorance. The power of making invisible things visible, which is what tonight's rain-soaked meeting is trying to do, make the reality of work and poverty visible enough that people can't maintain the selective blindness anymore. You're soaked through by the time you reach your room, and tomorrow you'll probably be coughing, develop that familiar tickle that either goes away in a few days or becomes something more serious. But tonight you're thinking about the things that haven't happened yet. You're thinking about what could be. It's a dangerous way to think, potentially a distraction from the present, but the rain made it possible, and sometimes you need a little danger to keep believing you're alive. The sun is setting red, not the pleasant red of a painting, but an aggressive, almost angry red, and you've decided to walk the length of London as a kind of farewell to weeks here, a way of marking time by moving through space. You start at the docks at that moment when the light is exactly between day and night, when the cranes are throwing shadows like desperate gestures, and the ships are becoming silhouettes against the violence of the sky. The water reflects the sky's rage in streaks of crimson and orange, and then gradually, you're not sure exactly when it happens, the transition is so slow and constant. The sun drops below the horizon, and the fog rolls in from the Thames like something alive, something hungry, something determined to reclaim the spaces humans think they've organised. The warehouses loom as you walk, their shapes becoming abstract in the fog, until you're moving through a landscape that could be any city or no city at all, just geometry and dampness and the sound of your footsteps on stone. The river is invisible now, but you know it's there. You can smell it, that particular mixture of salt and industrial waste, and things that have been dumped and things that have always been here. Organic things and the products of human industry mixed together into a kind of archaeological stew. Once London was a trading village on this river. Now it's an empire's blood vessel, pumping goods and people and wealth outward. And the river is both the highway and the sewer, the source of wealth and the repository of waste. The walk toward Whitechapel takes you past Lighterman's landings and past the spaces where the cargo is stacked, like problems waiting to be solved, like manifestations of London's hunger. The fog swallows the details until everything is just a progression of lights appearing and disappearing, Lamps in windows, candles burning in ships' hulls, the occasional policeman's lamp carried through the thickness like a small beacon of order trying to maintain authority over the mist. The city becomes dreamlike in the fog, less real somehow, which might be why the fog is so popular with criminals, and also why it's so terrible for everyone trying to just live, just survive, just get from one place to another without incident. When you reach Whitechapel proper, it's darker but also more populated. The evening is still young enough that people are moving through the streets with purpose, heading toward the 10 Bells or the pubs or back toward lodgings, or sometimes just moving because staying still is hard. You stop and eat something, pie probably, or maybe bread, from a vendor who knows you by now and doesn't ask questions. The gaslit pools of light on the corners create little worlds of visibility surrounded by the fog, and you move from one to another like you're stepping from island to island, each one briefly warm and visible before you step back into the darkness. The 10 Bells is lit and warm and full of the usual density of humanity, but you don't go in. You keep walking, past the Dorset Street lodging houses, where dozens of people sleep in single rooms, past the dark stretches where the fog is thickest and the sounds of the city become muffled and strange. Somewhere out here, there are people sleeping in doorways. Somewhere out here, there are people doing things they shouldn't and things they have to, things that survival demands and society condemns. The fog keeps them invisible to anyone who isn't specifically looking, and most people have learned not to look. There are sandwich board men walking the streets even at this hour. Human advertisements moving through the dark, their signs announcing sales or shows or morality lectures, or patent medicines that definitely don't work but someone's paying good money for them to promise that they do. They look exhausted, these walking signs, and you feel a kinship with them that's probably unhealthy. You're both just moving through the city, carrying something that isn't quite yours, existing as vectors for someone else's message or someone else's profit. Historians still argue whether the Victorian paradox, the greatest empire the world has ever known, and simultaneously the worst poverty those empire builders allow at home, represents genuine hypocrisy, or whether it was somehow logical, inevitable, even deserved, whether the same systems that create wealth abroad create poverty at home, and whether that's a feature or a bug. But standing in the fog, moving through Whitechapel, you don't have the energy for philosophy. You're just tired and cold and aware that morning will come and the whole thing starts again. The same schedule, the same streets, the same calculations. The gaslight on the corner near your street flickers. Probably not enough fuel, probably about to go out, and you watch it struggle against the dark and lose, the light dying to just a glow before recovering again. It feels like a parable about something, about persistence or resignation, or the futility of trying to hold back the darkness with fire, but you're too worn to figure out what. Your lodging house looms up through the fog like it always does, solid and ordinary and smelling like all the people who have slept in it and will sleep in it. Your home. That's what you call it now. Home. That's what happens when you stay in a place long enough. It stops being temporary and becomes actual, becomes the place you return to, becomes the place you measure other places against. It becomes the place that knows you by the sound of your footsteps. You're ready to go inside now. You're ready for fourpence and a thin mattress and the knowledge that tomorrow you'll do this again, and the day after that, and the day after that. You hand over your fourpence and climb the narrow stairs to your room, and the world begins to narrow. The hallway smells like it always does, like other people's sleep and other people's bodies, and the kind of accumulated weariness that comes from too many lives squeezed into too little space, from breath and skin, and the particular scent of exhaustion. Someone's coughing behind a door, a hard hacking sound that suggests something permanent. Someone's laughing, high and brittle. Someone's probably weeping, though you can't hear it because tears are quiet and grief is a private thing, even when you're sharing a wall with 20 other people. Your room is small enough that you can stand in the centre and touch both walls if you stretch, if you're careful about your positioning. The mattress is thinner than good sense would suggest, but it's yours for the next few hours and that's enough. You sit on the edge and begin unlacing your shoes, and as you do, the images of London begin to drift through your mind like fog itself. The dock cranes moving against the sky, slow and heavy and inevitable. The match girls walking out and winning something small but real, the possibility that another way might be available. The children playing in the Sunday streets with the intensity of people who know playtime is temporary. The woman at the market bargaining with the desperation of someone who knows exactly how little she matters to the mathematics of the economy. All of it passes through your mind like a slideshow, one image replacing another. The 10 Bells is still out there somewhere, still full of people who have nowhere else to go and nowhere else to be, still pouring drinks for people who need the numbness more than they need the money. The warehouses are still breathing their industrial breath, still storing the goods that make London wealthy and the people moving them poor. The Thames is still moving toward the sea the way rivers do, indifferent and constant and inevitable. But you're here now, and the city is becoming smaller and smaller, just the shape of your room, just the sound of your own breathing, just the knowledge that you've made it to another night. You remove your clothes and fold them on the chair. You've learned that much anyway in weeks of living like this. Careful with your possessions, because possessions are all you have. The warmth of the mattress, thin as it is its own kind of luxury, something that costs 4p but gives back more than money's worth. Your body sinks into it with a sigh that comes from deeper than your lungs. Somewhere in the building, a cart horse is clip-clopping past the street, its hooves making that sound that becomes the heartbeat of the city if you listen long enough. Somewhere, distant and made even more distant by the fog and the walls and the thickness of sleep, someone is singing, badly, off-key, but singing anyway, which means they still have that much, still have the capacity to make sound from their own body. The sounds are fading now, or maybe you're fading into them, the way people do when exhaustion becomes complete enough. The fog is muffling everything anyway, turning all the sound of the city into something gentle and distant. It's muffling the city until London becomes just a suggestion, just a series of impressions and sounds that could be any city or no city at all. The gaslight in the street flickers through your window, and you watch it grow dimmer as your eyes grow heavier. Watch the light pulse once and then settle into steadiness. You're thinking of 5 million souls settling into sleep across London tonight. 5 million people lying in rooms like this one, or better ones, or worse ones, all of them tired in their own ways. All of them dreaming or not dreaming, all of them here in this moment suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. The empire sleeps. The poorest and the richest both close their eyes. For a few hours the inequality pauses. For a few hours, exhaustion is the only true democracy that London offers, the one system that doesn't distinguish between the wealthy and the working. Your breathing becomes slower. Your thoughts become less words and more images, less narrative and more pure sensation. The warmth spreading through your body like a slow fire. The weight of blankets that cost approximately 3p when they were new and are now older than that. The knowledge that morning won't come for hours, that you have time still, that the night is yours to occupy. The absolute certainty that you're exhausted enough to not dream tonight, to just sleep and exist and be unconscious for the first time since you woke at 7 this morning, to surrender entirely to the body's need. The gaslight outside flickers once more, a gentle pulse of light through the dark window, and then settles into steadiness, burning its small fire against the London night. Somewhere, another gaslight is being lit by someone making their rounds. Somewhere, other lights are going out as the night deepens. The city breathes. You breathe. Everything is warm now. Everything is possible to forget now, all of it receding into the distance like a dream that's already dissolving. Your eyes close, London fades, tomorrow pauses. There's only sleep now, and sleep is close enough to peace that you'll accept it. There's only the sensation of weight and warmth, and the knowledge that for the first time all day, nobody needs anything from you. Nobody's asking, nobody's demanding. You're alone, and that's a kind of peace too, a kind of freedom. The gaslight flickers once more, as if to say goodnight. The fog swallows the streets. 5 million souls settle deeper into their beds, sinking down into the mattresses and blankets and the arms of other people. Your body, heavy and tired and finally released from the work of being you, sinks into darkness. Your mind lets go, your breath becomes steadier, you're falling into sleep like falling into water, like falling into something that catches you.